Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into a world where the noblest fear wasn't poison betrayal or bad poetry, it was cheese. But not just any cheese. Cold cheese. Yes, really. You're standing at the far end of a candlelit banquet hall. The ceilings are so high you can't see where they end. Banners flutter slightly even though there's no wind. There's a scent in the air, something rich, fermented, a little nutty, and as your gaze lowers, you see at a long table covered in a pristine white cloth, silver goblets, sparkling roasted meats steaming, and right in the center, a cheese platter, untouched, chilling. So before you relax, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. Also, feel free to comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not here for gossip, though there's plenty. You're here for observation. You've been assigned a quiet corner seat as part of the entourage, which really means you get to sit, sip, and not be noticed. Except something is being noticed. All night long, one dish goes unclaimed: the cheese. Not just any cheese, this is a selection curated by the abbot's own brother, aged in cool monastery caves, hand-wrapped in beeswax, brushed with herbs, perfumed with juniper ash. It is supposed to be divine, but it is also cool to the touch. And that's a problem. See, in the medieval world, especially among the nobility, food wasn't just nutrition. It was energy, warmth, personality. Cold food was considered dead, not spiritually necessarily, though that came into it, but emotionally, bodily, humorally dead. Humorally, yes, we're going there. You remember the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Medieval medicine lived and died by these, and food was judged not by calories or flavor, but by how it affected the humors. Cold cheese, they believed, encouraged melancholy. Not the romantic kind, the heavy weeping kind. Add in damp weather and a poor night's sleep, and you might find yourself haunted by a wheel of brie. No joke, some treatises warned against eating cheese at night altogether. Lactis opacitas nocturnum visum impedit, wrote one 13th century physician. Translation: the opacity of milk hinders night vision. That's right, cheese might literally make you see ghosts in the dark. So here you are, watching dukes and dames pass that platter like it's cursed. One servant gets too close, looks down in horror, and quickly replaces his tray with boiled carrots. Someone laughs nervously. Someone else coughs the way one does when there's nothing to say but too much to fear. You lean back and wonder, how did it get to this? Here's a historical fact you might not expect: cheese was actually a beloved part of the medieval table. Monks perfected it. Peasants relied on it. Nobles treasured imported wheels from Alpine valleys and English abbeys. But timing mattered. Cheese had to be warmish, or at the very least room temperature, but in a room warmed by fires and conversation. Cold cheese suggested negligence, a signal that the kitchen had grown inattentive, or worse, that the host had lost control. In the hierarchy of feasts, a cold course served too cold was a breach of etiquette. Like giving someone a limp handshake in slow motion, except the handshake is made of fermented curd and aristocratic pride. So here's the quirk: some noble families employed cheese warmers, not a joke, but a literal role. Picture a velvet-gloved hand hovering over a heated stone, gently rotating wedges until their edges sweated just enough to gleam, but not enough to droop. And if you think that's strange, consider this: some believed cheese temperature could affect memory. A French court physician claimed too much cold cheese dulled the mind and made one forget the names of distant cousins, an unforgivable offense in inheritance law. You sip from your goblet and glance at the platter again. Still there, still untouched. But now, someone's reaching for it. A young page, barely older than a squire, nervously slides a sliver onto a wooden plate. The room holds its breath. It's 1 second, 2. No thunder, no gasps. No sudden vomiting of bees, as one chronicler once claimed befell a knight who consumed chilled goat cheese on a fast day. Instead, the boy smiles. Just then, the lord of the manor stands. He raises a hand not to applaud, but to dismiss the cheese altogether. A servant scurries forward, removes the tray, and disappears behind the tapestries. The hall exhales. You realize something: the fear isn't about cheese. It never was. It's about what cold cheese represents: loss of control, social decay, a hint that the hearth is no longer central. That brings us to a curious academic question: were nobles truly afraid of the cheese? Or were they afraid of what it said about them, about the structure of order, warmth, and timing breaking down? Of course, you won't find that in the footnotes of a feast, but you might find it whispered in kitchens, sung by pages, and scrawled in the margins of culinary manuals with inky fingers and nervous glances. And now, as you lean further back, you notice your own plate. Still warm, no cheese. Just how you like it. And speaking of things best served warm, you may be wondering if cold cheese was so feared. What about cold soup? That's another tale. But it begins with a monk, a melon, and a summer scandal at an abbey picnic. Don't worry, we'll get there. For now, let the candles flicker low, and your thoughts drift like steam over a calm platter. Let go of the judgmental cheese and embrace the fact that some fears are just curdled nostalgia. And as for the young page who dared to taste it, he got promoted or haunted. No one knows. The next night begins with a different hall, a different host, and a different cheese. Tonight you find yourself wandering through the echoing corridors of a stone manor perched on a windy hilltop. The air is thick with the scent of bay leaves, old timber, and something slightly sour. You're not sure if it's vinegar from the pickling barrels or anticipation. You trail behind the steward as he leads guests to the dining room where a fire crackles, casting gold and shadow across tapestries. One of them catches your eye, a scene of a knight slaying a serpent. Except look closer, he isn't holding a sword. He's holding a wedge of cheese. This isn't just decor, it's a warning. Tonight the theme is vigilance, and everyone here knows what happened the last time cheese was served too cold. It started, they say, with a whisper. The cheese is watching. Yes, watching. The fear wasn't that cheese could spoil, it was that it could sense. You find your seat third from the end, not quite noble, but close enough to hear the chatter. A lady in blue silks murmurs about a cousin who claimed her cheddar growled. Another says her husband swears the blue veins in his Roquefort formed the face of a bishop he once betrayed. You nod politely as if this is perfectly normal. And in a way, it is. Here's the historical truth. Medieval people lived in a world where boundaries between living and non-living were blurry. Stones could bleed, trees could sigh. Food had moods, especially cheese. Some believed certain wheels were born under Mars, hot-tempered and prone to mold wars. Others under the moon, pale, soft, and emotionally unpredictable. To cut into a moon cheese on a Tuesday, risky business. This is where we meet cheese diviners. In several 14th century Italian towns, fortune tellers would use patterns in cheese molds to predict weather, love, or plague. The blue specks they claimed formed letters. The rinds cracked like runes. Even the texture, crumbly or creamy, told of fortunes to come. And before you roll your eyes, remember these were the same centuries where people trusted bloodletting to cure fevers, believed in prophetic dreams, and thought sneezes revealed your soul. Moldy dairy was no more absurd than fire reading or dream books. Which brings us to a curious case. You overhear the story being retold across the table in hushed tones. It happened in Bruges, supposedly. A wealthy merchant hosted a feast for visiting Genoese partners. The final course was a prize Stilton stored carefully for 2 weeks in a damp cellar. But when served, the cheese squeaked. No one knows whether it was gas temperature or just a squeaky cutting board. But the guests froze. One muttered, "It's alive." Another insisted he saw it quiver. Negotiations collapsed. The Genoese left. The merchant's business fell apart. And for years afterward, children in that quarter called any unlucky cheese the Bruges mouse. It's this kind of tale that keeps tonight's guests eyeing their platters suspiciously. A plump servant in green breeches steps forward and unveils tonight's selection: a soft French bloomy rind, a hard Iberian wedge, and an English blue that's practically humming with color. They're beautiful. And yet, no one moves. It's not just fear, it's etiquette. Because here's your historical detail of the evening. In noble households, you never took cheese first. Cheese came last. It was the quiet finale, the sigh after a loud meal. But it also had implications. Taking the first piece could signal ambition. Taking the last piece could imply resentment. But the real danger was in hesitating and letting the cheese go cold. This dance of timing became so intricate that some households employed what scholars now jokingly call cheese diplomats. Trained stewards who would circulate the platter, gently offering selections in a socially neutral way, ensuring no one got too much power. Or too cold a bite. One such steward, according to a letter found in a monastery near Ghent, carried a heated spoon under his belt, just in case. But tonight's servant has no spoon, only trembling hands and a hopeful smile. As the platter passes, you notice something: the blue cheese has a crack, just along the edge, shaped almost like an eye. A woman across from you gasps. The lord of the manor says, half joking, "Looks like it's winking." Someone drops a fork. This might be a good time for a few light observations. In the Middle Ages, cheese could apparently ruin your marriage, your mood, and your soul. Blue veins weren't just decoration, they were the dairy version of Morse code. If you saw your ex's face in a wheel of cheese, you were either cursed or lactose intolerant. But let's come back to the eye. You look again. It's just a fissure, probably from drying out in the air, but your mind wanders. What if cheese could watch? What would it see? The gossip, the gluttony, the mismatched goblets, or would it simply judge you for storing it next to onions? This leads to an odd academic question. Were these stories simply metaphors for social anxiety? Was the watching cheese really about surveillance secrets, the pressure of hosting? Could the trembling wedge at the end of the meal be a mirror revealing how deeply the noble class feared scrutiny? You don't answer, you simply eat, because despite the murmurs, the platter has come to you. And the eye, well, it's already cracked. You take a slice, let it rest on your tongue. Warm, creamy, slightly tangy. Nothing happens, except the quietest sound, like someone exhaling behind you. You turn, no one's there. Just the tapestry and the night. Still holding that cheese. Still slaying that serpent. And maybe, just maybe, smiling a little. Tonight the wind is louder than usual. It whistles through the shutters of a small keep tucked in the hills of Burgundy. You're seated near the hearth this time, closer than you expected, but no one's complaining. The fire crackles, the chairs creak, and the cheese. Well, it's arrived early. This is not a banquet for nobles, but a gathering of minor officials, clerks, and one slightly infamous alchemist who smells of vinegar and burnt feathers. They're all here for what was supposed to be a casual meal after court business. But of course, when there's cheese on the table, nothing stays casual for long. Tonight's selection is local, firm, aged a little nutty. It's been cut in tidy wedges, arranged like sunbeams on a pewter plate. But what's odd is the space in the center, empty. A ring of cheese without a heart. Someone leans in and mutters, "There should be an apple." And just like that, the table stills. Because if you know your food superstitions, and by now you do, you know that a missing apple in a cheese ring is no small matter. Here's your historical fact of the evening. Medieval diners often paired cheese with apples, not just for flavor, but for balance. Cheese was hot and moist, while apples were cold and dry in the parlance of humoral medicine. Together they stabilized the body, soothed digestion, and prevented what was politely called cheese storms. But when the apple is missing, that's when the bad omens start. You recall a passage from a 14th century English herbal. To serve the ring of cheese without its core is to invite silence upon thy house and tremors in the bones. Some believed it signaled betrayal. Others thought it awakened dormant spirits in the dairy. Which brings us to a curious detail. The cheese ring, once broken, was often considered a circle of truth. You could ask it questions. One record from a nunnery outside Cologne describes how during Lent, the sisters would gather in the kitchen and whisper confessions to the cheese plate before baking it into pottage. The theory was that the dairy, humble and absorbent, would carry their burdens into the broth. Tonight's group isn't that pious, but they're definitely unnerved. The steward returns from the kitchen flustered. The apple's gone, vanished. He swears he sliced one, left it in vinegar to prevent browning, but now gone. Only a knife with a faint scent of clove remains. Someone jokes that the alchemist probably turned it into powder. He smiles but says nothing. You take a bite of the cheese. It's good. Sharp, grounded, faintly smoky, but without the apple it lingers on your tongue like an unfinished sentence. And that's when the stories begin. One woman recalls a banquet in Provence where the cheese was served before the meat, and guests wept the next day. Another claims her cousin was proposed to with a ring of cheese, and the marriage dissolved within a year because the core was a turnip. Laughter flutters like bats in the rafters. But there's also something else, a tale from Wales whispered by the clerk to your right. He says that once a bard sang a song so haunting it curdled the cheese on every platter. No one could eat it. It trembled in place. The host, embarrassed, ordered the cheese buried in the garden. The next spring, vines grew twisting, white-veined, bearing fruit that smelled like old bread and thyme. He pauses, then adds, "The villagers still don't plant there." You smile. Not because you believe it, but because you want to. Here's the oddity of medieval cuisine. Even the most ordinary things had stories. Especially the ordinary things. Bread had dreams. Ale could lie. Cheese had moods. And so the missing apple isn't just a kitchen error, it's a metaphor waiting to happen. Which brings us to our scholarly question of the night. Were these rituals and anxieties really about digestion? Or were they a way to structure the unknowable grief, love, ambition into edible form? By pairing slicing and serving cheese, just so were medieval people creating temporary order in a chaotic world. And when that order was broken by a missing apple, a cracked rind, or a squeak, they were reminded that the world beyond the table was full of surprises. Not all of them kind. A gentle joke to ease the tension. In the Middle Ages, the worst insult wasn't "you smell it," was "your cheese lacks center." Cheese circle sounds like a children's game until someone cries in Latin. You know it's serious when even the alchemist won't eat dairy. The meal winds down. The alchemist stands, mutters something about weather pressure and bad salts, and vanishes down the hall. The rest sip watered wine, nibble crusts, and watch the cheese ring. Still incomplete. You wonder, maybe the missing apple isn't a mistake. Maybe it's a reminder that sometimes the meal is meant to be unfinished. That silence is a spice, and that in the right company even a cracked cheese ring can feel whole. Tonight you arrive at the edge of the woods, literally. The manor is nestled in a clearing surrounded by old oaks and murmuring pines. The kind of trees that creak even when there's no wind. You've traveled all day and your boots still hold the scent of wet moss and road dust. But now at last you're here, greeted by warmth, the scent of sage and roast onion, and a peculiar sound. Humming, soft, wordless, coming from the kitchen. A monk in a patched wool robe stirs a pot over the hearth. His hood is down, revealing a shaved crown, a bent nose, and a look of utter peace. On the counter beside him, cheese. Several wheels, some crumbling, some weeping slightly at the edges, all arranged like sleepy planets. He doesn't look up when you enter. He just hums. "Do you hear them?" he finally says. You pause. "Hear what?" He taps a cheese. "They sing at night, especially the ones left out too long." You smile politely, but he's serious. So begins your night with the monk who whispered to cheese. Here's your historical fact. Many medieval monasteries were centers of cheese making. The monks with time, patience, and ideal cave cellars were the artisans behind Europe's finest wines. They cataloged textures, named rips and bubbles, argued over brine ratios, but they also had beliefs. Some monks treated cheese as a liturgical object, not sacred exactly, but spiritually sensitive. One 12th century abbot wrote that improperly blessed curds could echo the sins of the dairymaid. Another warned that cheese made during eclipses absorbed celestial confusion. This particular monk, let's call him Brother Etienne, is of the whispering variety. He believes each cheese holds emotion, that a Gouda left near a sad monk will develop cracks, that a chèvre kissed by laughter will bloom with better mold. You sit with him by the fire as he unwraps a small wheel, soft, creamy, marbled faintly with green herbs. It smells faintly of clover, old books, and mystery. He leans in, whispers. You may ask it one question. You blink. It has aged in silence, he says. It remembers. And so you ask half playfully, half sleepily, what was the first lie I ever told? The cheese does not reply, but it tilts, just slightly. Brother Etienne nods. It remembers, he says, but it forgives. You wonder how much of this is real, and how much is hunger, which brings us to the detail of the evening. Some monasteries documented cheese dreams. Yes, dreams. Monks recorded visions they had after consuming aged cheese, often during fasts or vigils. One entry from an abbey in Catalonia describes a monk dreaming of a cheese that contained a miniature cathedral. Another dreamed of a cheese that bled ink, which he used to write sermons. Were these hallucinations fermented dairy delusions? Or simply the mind unguarded by daylight making metaphors out of curds? Brother Etienne tells you of a legend. A novice once ate cheese before matins against orders. That night he dreamt of angels, but they were made of whey. One angel handed him a riddle. What has no voice but sings, no breath but sighs, no soul but remembers? The answer, of course, was cheese. He awoke sobbing, begged forgiveness, and became the monastery's finest Affineur cheese ripener for the next 40 years. You try to laugh, but the fire crackles louder. Brother Etienne places a wheel beside the hearth. It begins to sweat, glisten, release aroma, and hum very softly. You can't prove it, of course, but the sound is there. And here's the funny thing, modern historians largely dismiss these stories. They chalk it up to superstition, poor nutrition, mold-induced hallucinations. But what if it wasn't nonsense? What if cheese was the monks' way of talking to themselves? A culinary diary, a confessional you could spread on bread. That brings us to tonight's open question. Was medieval cheese culture not just about food, but about emotional expression? In a world where silence was rule and confession was ritual, did cheese become a language, a soft, edible gospel? Before you answer, Brother Etienne offers you a slice. It's warm, melting at the edges. Tastes of rosemary, wood smoke, and something floral you can't name. For a second, just one, you feel remembered. A few light thoughts to float you onward. In some monasteries, cheese duty was a punishment, but also the fastest way to become popular. A monk once tried to exorcise a sour cheese by chanting in reverse. The result, a cheese that squeaked like a duck. When asked if cheese had a soul, one abbot replied only if aged properly. You rise, Brother Etienne hums, and as you walk back through the stone hallway, you feel oddly lighter. Like something left you, or forgave you, or maybe just maybe hummed your name as you passed. You're in a different kind of hall tonight. No stone arches, no monks, no candlelit banquet tables, just polished marble gold embroidery and the unmistakable chill of power. This is a royal court, a real one, velvet cushions, golden goblets, and an audience so well dressed they could bankrupt a village just by blinking. You, of course, are merely observing. You're in the back row, politely invisible, but you're not here for ceremony. You're here for gas. Specifically, royal gas and kitchen spies, an episode in cheese history that's equal parts etiquette, espionage, and indigestion. It all begins with a course served midway through the royal meal. Not too early, not too late, timing is everything. The platter arrives heavy with roasted apples, caraway bread, and yes, Slices of semi-hard cow's milk cheese barely warm. And that's where the trouble starts. Because this is not just food, it is a test, an invisible one, a dairy gauntlet. You see in the high courts of medieval Europe, especially among the Valois and Plantagenets, bodily noise was not just embarrassing, it was a political liability. Laughter, snorts, and especially gas were signs of poor control. And in a world obsessed with hierarchy and control, even the digestion of your intestines had to behave nobly. Which brings us to tonight's historical fact. Nobles feared cheese-induced flatulence not for health reasons, but because it could signal weakness. Or worse, betrayal. There were even recorded cases of courtiers being demoted, excluded from meetings, or publicly humiliated for uncontrolled humors. One letter from a lady-in-waiting describes a duke blamed for bringing foul wind to the chess chamber. The source: cold cheese served too late in the evening. Here's where it gets stranger. Some nobles employed what we now jokingly call kitchen spies. Staff whose sole purpose was to monitor the preparation and timing of sensitive ingredients, especially cheese beans and onion-heavy sauces. Why? Because mistiming such ingredients could create consequences. Imagine this. You're in a tense diplomatic negotiation. The bishop from Avignon is posturing. The German envoy is sweating. And suddenly, the king coughs, shifts in his chair, and something rumbles. An opportunity, perhaps. Historians debate how much of this was superstition and how much was real sabotage. But we do know that kitchen staff were often bribed, pressured, or even threatened to alter dishes in tiny ways. Leave out fennel, change the salt, undercook the cheese. And since nobles rarely prepared their own food, the kitchen became a battlefield of invisible influence. There's a peculiar entry in a Castilian account book. 3 shillings for silence concerning the soft cheese at Lord Diego's reception. It doesn't say what happened. It doesn't have to. You notice tonight that several guests at the royal table are pushing cheese to the side. One daring young knight takes a bite. You watch him carefully. He chews, nods, swallows, and then nothing. The room collectively relaxes. But here's your peculiar detail for tonight. Some noble households train their staff to observe and record post-dining atmospherics. Not officially, of course, but in diaries and rumors in coded letters. Phrases like "the cheese spoke" or "the chamber turned" were all euphemisms. A bad dairy experience could be recast as divine punishment or even a sign of sorcery. One record describes a noble blaming evil air for his discomfort. Another blamed cheese laced with melancholia and sought a priest for spiritual cleansing. Let's pause for a few light observations. Medieval courts were louder with robes than with stomachs by design. Some nobles wore bells to mask acoustics. There was once a scandal called the Night of the Whispering Cheese, where multiple courtiers blamed the same platter. A noblewoman once faked fainting to hide a cheese-related outburst. She was rewarded with a new gown. Now here's the deeper question. Were medieval fears about cheese really about digestion or about control? Did nobles fear the food itself or the loss of composure that came with it? When power rests on stillness, silence, and certainty, even a grumble from the gut can shake a throne. And cheese so humble, so slow, so alive was unpredictable. Tonight, as the final course is cleared, you see the servant return the cheese tray to the kitchen. He walks slowly. One slice remains, and you know what they say, the last bite belongs to fate. You wonder who will eat it. You wonder what will happen. You smile, and you're quite certain someone somewhere is writing this all down. It's morning now, but not the kind that wakes you with sunshine. This is the gray kind, fog rolling in from damp fields. Chimney smoke curling like tired questions and the chill of stone that hasn't seen fire all night. You're in a manor outside Flanders, and though breakfast should be simple, something's off. The lady of the house, usually calm, is pacing. The steward is whispering, and the kitchen girl has burned the porridge for the 3rd time. Why? Because the cheese was served cold last night and someone took it personally. Welcome to melting class wars, where cheese isn't just food, it's status offense and quiet rebellion. You see, in medieval Europe, cheese wasn't just about taste. It was about timing, temperature, and most importantly, who got which piece. This morning's argument isn't about flavor, it's about insult. Let's start with the historical fact. Warm cheese was a sign of care, not just culinary effort, but social acknowledgement. If your cheese arrived slightly melted, gently warmed near a hearthstone or iron pan, it meant someone thought you mattered. But if it arrived cold, still firm, perhaps sweating awkwardly under its wax rind, that was a snub, especially if your neighbor's cheese was warm. One 14th century etiquette manual spells it out clearly. Let not thy neighbor's dairy steam whilst thine own lies cold, lest envy be stirred and kinship spoiled. Last night, during a modest supper, a visiting merchant's son received a wedge of warm cheese atop toasted rye. The host's younger brother, technically higher in status, got his still chilled from the cellar. He said nothing. But today no one can find the family cat. Coincidence maybe, but in medieval households, meals were performance. Every plate told a story. Every portion sent a signal. Cheese, in its deceptive simplicity, was one of the most powerful messengers. This leads us to a curious detail. Some households employed cheese orderers, individuals responsible for assigning who got which piece, not based on size, but on warmth, age, rind, thickness, a form of edible politics. In aristocratic feasts, it could go like this: the eldest gets the oozing center. The favored cousin gets the herb-crusted edge. The quiet scholar, he gets the firm end bit closest to the cold. Which brings us to the rebellion. In the 15th century, there was an incident in a household near Rouen where a kitchen boy deliberately reversed the cheese order. He gave the visiting noblewoman the cold slice and saved the warm center for a stable boy. No one noticed until the noblewoman loudly announced she felt soulfully undernourished. The kitchen boy was dismissed, but a year later he was found working in the court of a duchess, where he became her temperature steward. It turns out small acts of class resistance often started with cheese. Let's pause for a few gentle observations. In some courts, guests were told to touch their cheese before eating it to show appreciation or to test for sabotage. A nobleman once challenged another to a duel over an unevenly warmed platter. The cheese melted, the friendship didn't. Some say cold-hearted in English evolved from early kitchen slang for unheated brie. Here's your moment of ASMR. Imagine the slight scrape of a wooden spoon against a warm cheese rind. The whisper of steam, the quiet thud of bread soaking into softness. That's what the nobles wanted. What the peasants got: cold rinds, hard heels, crumbs. And that's where the war began. Because once the idea of deserved warmth enters your head, it's hard to accept less. Which leads us to tonight's question: was cheese temperature a class issue because of food science? Or because it reflected how people felt seen? If your slice is cold, does that mean you're being ignored? And if your plate steams, does that mean you finally arrived? The steward finally appears with the morning tray. On it, 2 slices. One is warm, golden soft. The other firm, pale, cold. He looks at you. You look at him. No words are exchanged. But you know today your role in this household will be determined by which slice you pick. And just as your fingers move toward the warmer one, you change course. It does, Jim. You take the cold. Because power, after all, sometimes hides in the act of choosing differently. And because deep down you're curious what stories the cold cheese might tell if given the chance. The road is long, but the scent of thyme and ashes follows you like a stubborn companion. You've left the manor behind for a quiet village tucked between hills where goats outnumber people and gossip comes in cheese-shaped rumors. No banquets here, no velvet, just stone cottages, woolen shawls, and a chapel bell that rings slightly off-key. You're staying the night with a family of cheesemakers. They don't speak much. The grandfather nods more than he talks. The children peek around corners with bread crusts in hand. And the matron, an impressive figure with forearms like rolling pins, places a bowl of stew in front of you, along with a slice of bread and one very strange-looking chunk of cheese. It's pale yellow but almost translucent, firm but flexible. It jiggles faintly. Eat slow, she says. It listens. You don't laugh, not anymore. Because tonight is about the curdled cure when cheese wasn't just food but medicine, or punishment, or something in between. Let's begin with a common medieval truth. Cheese was considered medicinal, and not just in the good calcium kind of way. According to 13th century apothecaries, cheese had properties that could warm the chest dry. The humors soften the bowels, cloud the mind, or restore vigor depending entirely on its temperature, age, animal of origin, and phase of the moon. Here's your historical fact of the night medieval physicians prescribed cheese for ailments ranging from toothaches to heartbreak. One text suggests wrapping fresh goat cheese in linen, soaking it in wine, and pressing it against the forehead for melancholia brought by memory. Another suggests boiling hard cheese with herbs and feeding it to those suffering from restless limbs, which sounds like the medieval version of a sleep aid. But there's a darker side to this curdled cure. In some villages, certain cheeses were used not to heal but to correct behavior. A boy who lied too often. A slice of sour ewe's milk cheese mixed with horseradish. A girl who daydreamed during weaving cold unsalted cheese at every meal for a week. And worse, cheese was sometimes withheld as punishment for envy, gossip, or laziness. Because as odd as it sounds, cheese in the medieval world was a barometer of community mood. To share cheese was to acknowledge someone's place at the table. To deny it was quiet exile. You take a bite of the strange cheese, it's rubbery, herbal, slightly sweet. The matron nods approvingly. Eat it. For sleep, she says. You chew carefully. Then she sits beside you and tells a story. Once long ago, there was a midwife who delivered children with cheese. No, not fed it to them, used it. She believed the scent of warm curds calmed mothers, that the presence of milk made birth smoother, that cheese absorbed pain. Some called her mad, others called her holy. When she died, they found a scroll in her home with over 40 recipes for comfort cheese. None of them survived, except perhaps this one. You look at the children. They're watching you now. One clutches a cloth doll. The other gnaws a rind. The grandfather coughs softly and points to the fire where another cheese rests on a stone near the edge. He says only one word, bitter. And you know not all cheese was made to comfort. Here's your quirky detail for the evening. In some remote areas, a cheese called mordentia. Literally, the bitter one was used to confront grief. It was eaten at wakes. Its flavor was sharp, unpleasant, and meant to make you weep. To eat it was to admit that sorrow had a taste. In contrast, there was dulcis curdula, a soft honeyed cheese used at weddings. Sweet, fragrant, symbolic of shared sweetness to come. So cheese in all its textures and moods became a language. And that brings us to tonight's deeper question. Was medieval medicinal cheese truly about healing the body? Or was it about giving shape to emotion? A way to acknowledge what couldn't be named. A few quiet thoughts before you drift. Some cheese wheels were marked with prayers, eaten in pieces each day until a person felt joy. A bishop once banned giggled curds after monks consumed them before Mass and couldn't stop laughing. The phrase cutting the cheese originally meant to slice off a piece of aged curd for the sick. The other meaning came later. The matron clears your bowl. The fire dies low. Outside, goats murmur in their sleep. You lie on a straw mattress under a heavy quilt, your belly warm with broth and sleep cheese. And as your eyes close, you think about how strange it is that something as quiet, as slow, as humble as cheese could carry so many stories, so many cures. And maybe tonight it will carry you. It's fasting day. The bells toll low and slow as if they too are conserving energy. You're in a small priory perched above a river bend. The morning is thick with mist, and even the sparrows seem to be whispering instead of chirping. You've arrived at a curious time, just after the bell for none, when the monks are allowed a small bite to break the long silence. But no meat, of course. No fat. Nothing that would stir the appetite too much. And yet, there's cheese on the table. Or at least something that looks like cheese. It's pale, wobbly, dusty with ground almonds, and it smells faintly like boiled milk and walnuts. This is not your average cheese. This is the monk's fast day cheese, and it's not cheese at all. Tonight's story is about illusion, devotion, and culinary theater. Because when real cheese was forbidden, medieval monks invented fakes that fooled even the devout. Let's begin with your historical fact. During fasting periods, particularly Lent and Ember Days, monastic rules forbade the consumption of animal products. This included meat, eggs, butter, and, yes, cheese. But monks were nothing if not creative. Enter the cheese without cow, a miracle of almonds, bread pulp, and herbal infusions molded into dairy disguise. One 14th century Carthusian recipe reads like a riddle: grind the nut to mimic the curd, press it with cloth as penance, flavor it with salt and prayers. You take a bite, it's soft, nutty, and almost chalky. A little bland but calming. The monk beside you chews in silence. After a while he says the trick is in the patience. Like all good sins. You glance sideways. Was that a joke? He doesn't smile, but his eyes do. You soon learn that creating mock cheese wasn't just a loophole, it was an art form. In some monasteries, there were cheese masters whose entire duty was to craft fasting-friendly versions of forbidden foods. One particularly skilled monk, Brother Gregor of Mainz, was known for his shadow dairy, almond milk cheddar, oat curd ricotta, and even soft-boiled eggs made from layered pea paste and oil. Visitors described his table as a vision of temptation made of virtue. Which brings us to our quirky detail of the night in one abbey. A prankish novice sculpted an entire roast chicken from almond cheese and beet glaze. He served it on a fast day with a straight face. The abbot took one bite and whispered, "Repent," but also to share the recipe. There's something touching about this kind of devotion, not just to faith, but to flavor, to memory, to continuity. Because even when restricted medieval cooks, especially monastic ones, refused to surrender ritual, they believed eating was an echo of Eden, a rehearsal of grace. And if they couldn't have real cheese, they would at least sculpt its memory. You sip thin broth and chew your imitation dairy. It has a strange calmness to it, like eating history itself. And here's the quiet question for tonight. Did these culinary fictions help monks maintain faith? Or did they blur the line between sacrifice and indulgence? Was fake cheese an act of devotion or a beautifully wrapped indulgence? Some theologians argued about it. Others simply asked for seconds, a few soft thoughts before sleep. Some monks believed fake cheese tasted better because it was born of discipline. Others believed it could tempt the devil, who, according to legend, was confused by substitutions. One friar declared that imitation cheese fooled the tongue but taught the soul. The sun has faded and the mist curls like folded parchment around the cloister windows. The monk beside you rises, nods once, and slips away his robes, making no sound. You remain at the table a little longer, marveling that what you just ate, though made of nuts and patience, carried the same weight as the finest aged cheddar. It wasn't just food, it was restraint, memory, longing. And strangely, it was enough. You wake to bells again, soft this time, distant. Maybe even inside your own head. The priory is quiet, but not asleep. Monks glide silently through the corridors, their footsteps blending with the hush of parchment and water dripping from mossy eaves. Today is colder and the fast still holds. No meat, no eggs, no butter. And yet something strange is being stirred. You follow the scent to the kitchen, not garlic, not broth. Something richer, nutty, almost creamy but sharper. In a small copper pot, a monk is stirring and something. It's pale, thin, and steaming gently. He lifts the spoon and lets it drizzle back into the pot slowly. With reverence. "What is it?" you whisper. He doesn't look up. "Milk," he says, "but from a fish." You blink. Thus begins fish milk and mock eggs. Your quiet descent into the culinary wizardry of medieval fast days, where monks cornered by restriction invented edible illusions that would make modern chefs blush. Here's your historical fact. During strict fasts, the church forbade animal products, except for fish. This technicality opened a culinary loophole that medieval cooks joyfully abused. The result: fish milk, derived from soaked pounded fish bones mixed with almond milk, wine, and starch. Strained, heated, thickened, seasoned, then, depending on the monastery, either consumed as broth or disguised as something else entirely. In some monasteries, it was poured into eggshells, chilled, then carefully cracked back out and sliced like boiled eggs. They called it ova ficta, false eggs. You glance around, no one seems to find this strange. The monk stirs, slowly adding a pinch of saffron. For the yolk, he murmurs. He offers you a spoon. You sip. It's surprisingly delicate. Hints of salt almond and something like ocean air. The warmth lingers in your throat, not in flavor, but in memory. And just like that, you realize this isn't deception, it's ritual. They're not pretending the food is something else. They're honoring what it once was, what it means to want something and not take it. To crave butter but stir almonds instead. To remember yolk without breaking a shell. Which brings us to tonight's curious detail. Some abbots were so serious about edible illusions that they kept books not of recipes but edible metaphors. One entry reads, "Let the mock cheese remind the tongue of what is denied. Let it train the soul in softness." Another describes a dish shaped like a dove, made entirely of peas and oat glue, served to remind monks of the Holy Spirit during Easter Vigil. These weren't jokes. They were edible prayers, a few quiet observations to soften the edges. A novice once shaped almond paste into the likeness of the abbot's face. It was both flattery and dessert. In one priory, monks painted their mock eggs with beet juice so they could crack them dramatically like theater. A bishop once declared that culinary illusions were a lesser sin than grumbling. So tonight's question is this: were these monastic mock foods a spiritual test, a theological loophole, or simply art? Did they blur lines between need and memory, or did they clarify them? The meal ends quietly. The monk washes his pot with ash and water, leaving no trace of the fish that wasn't, or the egg that never existed. You sit near the window watching the fog roll back. A sparrow lands on the sill, looks at you, then hops away. You realize you're full, not just of food, of stillness, thought, echoes of eggs that never were. And outside, someone rings the bell again. But this time, it sounds like a laugh. By now, the rhythm of monastic life has settled into your bones, the bells, the silence, the hush of robes moving past candlelight. But today is different. Today is the feast of St. Mildred. And though fasting rules still apply, the kitchen is unusually animated. Monks are bustling. Bowls clink. There's flour on everyone. Even the normally stoic Brother Etienne looks like he's suppressing a grin, because today they're making cheese that wasn't cheese, but in a way that's meant to delight, not deceive. Tonight's tale is about joyful illusion, culinary creativity, and the sacred art of pretending something is almost something else, just enough to make the soul chuckle. The first thing you see when you step into the kitchen is a tray of what look like miniature cheese wheels. They're soft, perfectly round, and resting on cabbage leaves. But as you lean closer, you realize they're sweet. This is almond curd sugar cheese dusted with ground rose petals and molded with a carved wooden press. It looks like dairy. It smells like a garden. It's a dessert masquerading as asceticism. You take a bite. It melts first floral, then nutty with a soft spice finish that lingers like memory. Brother Etienne watches you. Fake food, he says, real joy. Here's your historical fact for the evening. By the late 14th century, monasteries, especially wealthy ones, had perfected the art of playful fasting. They couldn't eat real cheese or butter or eggs during certain seasons, but that didn't stop them from crafting entire feasts of visual illusions. Fish-shaped pastries, eggless puddings molded into shells, cakes that looked like roast birds, even cheese wheels made entirely from crushed hazelnut saffron and a touch of honey aged in cold cellars just long enough to smell convincingly fermented. Some monks saw this as a holy joke. Others saw it as culinary theater, a chance to bring celebration into the very heart of restraint. And some, well, they just loved cooking. Which brings us to tonight's delightful detail, the jester-cook tradition. In a few northern monasteries, one monk per feast day was appointed the cocus joculator, the culinary fool. His job was to design dishes that surprised, delighted, and occasionally confused the brethren. One popular creation, flying cheese. A small puff pastry filled with almond cream designed to collapse mid-bite and leave a trace of sweet on the nose. Another shrunken cheese rounds made from wine-soaked breadcrumbs and rolled in dried mint, served on a miniature cart pushed across the table by a giggling novice. Laughter was not just allowed, it was invited. And in this moment, as the monks gather for their mid-feast treat, you realize something. This isn't about deception. It's about memory, joy, and shared understanding. The illusion doesn't hide truth, it reveals it. And here's your open-ended question for the night. Did these edible games allow monks to experience spiritual joy more fully by offering permission to delight within boundaries? Or did they blur the line between reverence and play? Was it reverent mischief? Or mischievous reverence? A few whispers of thought light as powdered sugar. A monk once crafted cheese coins for the abbey's treasurer. They were eaten before the real accounting began. In a monastery garden, herbs for fake cheese were labeled truth in disguise. A brother once joked, "If the devil ever comes to dinner, may he be fooled by our cheese." The feast ends with prayer, not somber but warm. The monks thank the hands who shaped the meal, the saints who gave them a reason to gather, and the cheese. That wasn't. As you walk back to your cell full of nut curd and candlelight, you feel a little lighter. Not because you were fooled, but because just for a moment you were invited to play. And play, it turns out, is holy too. The wind tonight is different. It doesn't howl. It murmurs. Through shutters, along corridors, over rooftops, as if the buildings themselves are whispering secrets. You're back in a larger town now, a market hub with taverns, towers, and the clatter of wooden carts echoing through alleyways. But this story doesn't take place in a manor or monastery. It takes place in a kitchen. A narrow, smoky, dimly lit kitchen at the edge of a bustling noble house. And it begins with a kiss. Not a romantic one, a scandalous one. Because tonight's tale is about the secret romance between a lady and her cheesemonger, and how dairy, desire, and danger once danced together in the shadows of privilege. You sit near the hearth watching as the kitchen staff move like clockwork. One stirs soup, another chops herbs. And in the corner, working silently over a wooden board, is a man in his 40s with quiet hands and eyes like old oak bark. He's shaping cheese, not just cutting it, sculpting it, forming curls, petals, layers. His fingers move with reverence, and every so often he glances quickly, nervously toward the servant entrance. You already know what this is. The love story isn't public, but it lingers in the air like nutmeg. The lady of the house, young, clever, born into lace and obligation, discovered him by accident. She'd wandered into the kitchen during a thunderstorm looking for tea. Instead, she found him pressing goat curd into tiny rose-shaped molds. She laughed. He did not, until the third visit. That's how it started: shared silence, then glances, then coded messages hidden in the food itself. A wedge of warm brie carved with the shape of a crescent moon. A soft cheese rolled in violet petals, the flower she wore to court. A wheel delivered too early, still warm, as if to say, "I couldn't wait." Here's your historical fact. In many noble households, the kitchen was a liminal space, half domestic, half political. And among staff, the cheesemaker held unusual sway. Not because of status, but because of access. He touched every plate that touched noble lips. And if he was clever, he could use that plate to whisper. Which brings us to a strange, sweet detail. In 15th century Milan, a court lady was caught receiving secret cheese letters. Not paper, actual curds shaped into symbols and layered like lasagna. Each layer told a part of a poem. She claimed they were gifts from a distant cousin. The cousin never existed, but the cheesemaker did. You sip warm cider and watch as tonight's cheesemaker slices a small wedge of soft white curd and gently presses a single clove into its center. It means something. You don't know what. But you know it means something. Now, before we drift further, a few soft thoughts. Some medieval cheeses were named for emotions, tender longing in her favor. A noblewoman once commissioned a cheese the size of a wedding ring, delivered daily until her fiancé proposed. In a few rare cases, cheesemakers were accused of emotional alchemy, which was not illegal but deeply frowned upon. So what happened to our couple? You hear it whispered later in the bathhouse. One evening, the lady served guests a plate of cheeses shaped like lilies, his favorite flower. That same night he vanished. No one knows where. Some say he fled to Florence. Others say he entered a monastery and never touched dairy again. She never married, but every year on the feast of St. Bridget she ordered a platter of violet-petal cheeses, served warm. Which leads us to tonight's quiet question in a world ruled by arranged marriages and rigid roles: was cheese the only language some people had to speak honestly? Did its softness allow what spoken words could not? Did it melt barriers even if only briefly? You watch the cheesemaker finish his tray. He doesn't look up, but before he exits the kitchen he pauses just for a moment and sets one piece aside. It's smaller than the rest, simpler, but unmistakably shaped like a crescent moon. And for a second the wind outside seems to hum a lullaby only the kitchen remembers. It's the last night of winter. You're in a quiet village built around a crumbling stone church where every door creaks the same way and every chimney leans just slightly east. The snow outside is crusty, half melted, half stubborn, and the wind smells like soot pine and endings. You've been invited to supper by the local priest, not for prayer, but for something much older, much softer. He says it's a ritual, really. Then he hands you a bowl of soup and a small round of cheese. But this cheese isn't like the others. It's not pressed or salted or carved into roses. It's pale, trembling, and wrapped in fig leaves. And when you ask what it's called, he smiles and says the cheese of remission. Tonight you're exploring cheese and the church, where dairy meets doctrine, temptation meets theology. And something as humble as curd is caught in a holy tug of war. Let's begin with the historical fact the medieval church had an ambivalent relationship with cheese. On one hand, it was a staple. Monasteries made it. Pilgrims carried it. Fasting tables often replaced meat with cheese, at least in the earlier centuries. On the other hand, some bishops called it the food of forgetfulness. Why? Because it was pleasurable. Soft, warm, rich, slippery. Too easily enjoyed, by the 12th century, certain religious orders began to draw hard lines. The Cistercians banned soft cheese during Lent. Others forbade it outright during vigils. There are records of entire sermons dedicated to the dangers of untempered dairy. One preacher in Bologna claimed to eat cheese in darkness is to court the devil's whisper. That line was later embroidered on a kitchen towel, ironically. But what's fascinating is this: for every restriction there was also embrace. Many communities developed cheese rituals, small quiet acts of grace involving dairy. In some parishes, confessors would give cheese to penitents who completed their penance. Not money, not bread. Cheese, symbolic of forgiveness, nourishment, return. One 14th century document describes a widow receiving a wheel of comfort from the local bishop after her husband's passing. It was meant to be shared slowly over 3 days in silence, not for the body, for the heart. The priest refills your soup and tells you a story. Years ago, a boy in this village stole from the altar. Not much, just a gold-threaded cloth. When caught, he didn't deny it. But the priest didn't punish him. Instead, he made the boy cook. Every day for 40 days, the boy had to make fresh cheese, kneading curds by hand, folding herbs, warming milk with patience. No shortcuts. And on the final day, the boy served his cheese to the poor. He never stole again. He later became a cheesemonger. There's something poetic about that, which brings us to tonight's peculiar detail. In some regions, cheese was used in blessings. Farmers would bring wheels to the church before harvest. Brides would carry tiny cheese tokens in their pockets. And children were sometimes anointed with a dab of curd on the forehead to remember sweetness. Of course, not everyone approved. One 15th century friar ranted that such customs turned the holy into a dairy shop. He was promptly assigned kitchen duty for a year. A few soft thoughts to stir the soul. A cheese once left at the altar was said to bleed red wine. It was later revealed to be soaked in berries by a bored acolyte. Some monks carved prayers into cheese rinds, believing the melting would carry them heavenward. In one town, villagers believed a cheese gone moldy during Lent meant someone in the parish was lying. So here's your deeper question tonight. Was cheese's place in church life an accident of culture, or a symbol of quiet grace? When rules forbade and rituals embraced, was the contradiction a flaw or the point? Was it a reminder that holiness, like cheese, is soft at the center? The priest clears the table. The fire hums low. Outside, the snow has finally stopped. You cradle your last bite of cheese of remission, letting it melt slowly on your tongue. It tastes of sage, of ash, of honey left too long in the sun, and somehow of relief. You've been forgiven for nothing, but still you feel lighter. And as the bells ring again, faint, echoing, distant, you wonder. Maybe cheese is just a food, or maybe tonight it's a quiet form of prayer. The streets are muddy. Not in the usual sense, not rain, not runoff, but mud from celebration. Petals, bits of bread, something sticky that smells like honey and crushed thyme. You step carefully, weaving through a crowd that's half singing, half swaying. Today is a fair day, and this is not your usual sleepy monastery tale. This is the day cheese went public. You're in the heart of a spring festival in a Flemish town, wooden booths, jugglers, lute players, and one very determined man selling cheese on stilts. You blink. He wobbles. His apron says, "Blessed are the brie makers." No one questions him. 'Cause today cheese is everywhere. On bread, in pies, skewered and grilled, melted into bowls, molded into animal shapes for children and tiny towers for the wealthy. You're here for one particular reason, a legend. They say that once at this very fair a cheese caused a riot. And not just any cheese, a cold one. Let's start with your historical fact. Medieval fairs were one of the few places where all classes mingled. Peasants, merchants, monks, nobles in disguise, and every flavor of vagabond. And food, especially cheese, was the common language, but temperature that was still coded. Warm cheese was festive, sensual, present. Cold cheese a snub, which brings us to the legend, the tale of the cheese duel. The story varies depending on who tells it, but the heart is the same. Two merchants, one local, one from across the river, were competing over cheese sales at the spring fair. The local man served his slices warm, oozing slightly, resting on herb-crusted bread. The traveler, however, sold his cheese cold, firm, spiced and carved into perfect cubes. A noblewoman passed by. She tasted both. She smiled politely. Then she reached for the cold one. The crowd froze. An apprentice shouted treachery. Someone else shouted sorcery. What followed was a brawl involving cheese wheels as weapons, one accordion, and a donkey that no one claims to have brought. It ended with both merchants fined, the donkey promoted to fair mascot, and the noblewoman declaring she liked cheese that resisted. What does that mean? No one knows. But now every year on the anniversary of that fair, the town hosts a cheese duel, one platter warm, one cold. Spectators vote with bites. The winner receives a crown made of bread crusts and herbs. This year, you're one of the tasters. You take your job seriously. The warm cheese is a melted sheep's milk blend, wrapped in fig leaf dusted with rosemary. The cold cheese, a blue-veined wedge that smells like rain and confidence. You taste both. You think deeply. You vote for both. Because here's your peculiar detail of the night. In some towns, dual cheese diplomacy was a real thing. Local lords would serve two rival styles side by side and observe who chose what. The results were used to map loyalties, predict marriages, or bizarrely forecast weather. One parchment reads, "If the men choose goat and the women choose cow, expect storms and an uneventful harvest." Probably nonsense. Probably a few joyful crumbs of thought. One fair tradition involved hiding a ring in a wheel of cheese. Whoever found it had to sing, loudly, in falsetto. A traveling cook once disguised meat as cheese to bypass a fast-day fair ban. He was applauded, then excommunicated, then applauded again. Some towns believed that if cheese melted too fast during a fair, it meant the next winter would be mild. So here's tonight's deeper question. In moments of joy, did cheese become more than food? Did it become permission? Permission to taste, to laugh, to break roles. To forget status, if only for a day. When all you have is a bite of warmth, the decision to eat it slowly is a kind of festival in itself. You leave the fair as dusk falls. The stilts man tips his hat. The donkey, now wearing bells, nods regally. You don't take any cheese home. You don't need to. You're already full of bread, of stories, of shared laughter that tasted faintly of time. And as the music fades behind you, the mud doesn't seem so inconvenient after all. The next town over has no fare. No music, no stilts, no donkey. Just shutters drawn tight, a chapel with peeling paint, and a quiet square where pigeons outnumber people. You've arrived at dusk, guided by a midwife's directions and a letter folded 3 times, sealed with wax and the faintest scent of beeswax and cheese. Yes, cheese again, but this time it's not for celebration. Tonight you're here to witness when cheese became a confession. You're greeted not by a nobleman or monk, but by an elderly woman named Sanna. Her home is low-ceilinged, warm, full of herbs and the rustle of cloth. She moves slowly, carefully, like someone who has spent a lifetime listening to things that don't speak. She serves you a bowl of lentil stew and a platter with 2 slices of cheese. One is hard and dry, the color of straw. The other is soft, veined with blue sweating slightly onto the plate. You ask what they are. She replies, truth and forgiveness. And just like that, the story begins. Here's your historical fact of the night. In some corners of Europe, particularly the Alpine villages and Slavic borderlands, cheese was used in informal reconciliation rituals. Not official church doctrine, not law, but deeply rooted custom. If someone had wronged you, lied, stolen, betrayed, you could offer them a piece of cheese. Not out of generosity, but to invite a conversation, to place the weight of silence on the table. If they took it, it meant they were ready to speak. If they ate it, it meant they accepted their part. If they left it untouched, well, the wound remained. One 15th century record describes a woman who served her estranged brother a platter of 3 cheeses. One bitter aged in wormwood, one bland, unseasoned goat, and one sweet curd with honey and crushed mint. She said nothing. He took the sweet one. They never spoke of the matter again. But they shared meals until the day he died. Sanna gestures for you to eat. You choose the soft one, forgiveness, you assume. It's pungent, slightly aggressive, but it melts easily, fading into a nutty sweetness you didn't expect. She nods. That one's stronger, she says, but it's kinder. And now she tells you her own tale. Years ago, a man came to her door just before midnight, shaking barefoot, holding a single wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth. He didn't say his name, only asked for water. She gave him stew, bread, a place to sleep. In the morning, the cheese was on her windowsill, half eaten, the cloth folded neatly beside it. She never saw him again. But every spring since, a similar wedge arrives. No note, just cheese, left on her windowsill before sunrise. She doesn't know his name or what he's confessing, but she accepts it, because sometimes food is the only way we can speak. Let's pause with a few crumbs of quiet insight. In certain villages, the phrase breaking the rind was used to describe moments of reconciliation. A poet once wrote, "If you wish to be forgiven first, soften the cheese." Some households reserved a special wheel for long-held grudges, aged slowly, only eaten when the wound healed. So here's your question tonight. When words fail, can food fill the space? Is the act of offering a bite, however simple, a form of saying, I remember, I'm ready, I'm here? And if so, is accepting it not just nourishment, but renewal? You finish your plate. Sanna wraps the remaining slice in cloth and hands it to you. Give it to someone, she says, even if you don't know why yet. You leave her cottage under the moonlight, cheese in your pocket, silence in your hands. The wind is cold again, but it doesn't bite. It listens. And somewhere in the hush between night and morning, someone else might be waiting quietly to forgive. There's something strange about early morning markets. The air isn't awake yet. The stones are still cold. And the voices, when they do come, are low, careful, like secrets being bartered alongside onions and fish. You're in a coastal town now. A little port with crooked docks, striped awnings, and salt in every breath. The sea hums behind you, steady and soft, and ahead, a stall selling cheese. But not just any cheese. This one is under lock and key. Literally, you step closer. The woman behind the stall has iron-colored hair, a wide apron, and a ring of keys on her belt. The cheese, what little you can see, is sealed inside a small wooden box with a tiny brass lock and a sign that reads, "By request only." You ask politely what kind it is. She squints, then smiles. The last cheese. And so begins tonight's tale, The Last Cheese on Earth, a story not about scarcity but memory. And how cheese became the final chapter of so many stories, personal, political, even mythical. Here's your historical fact. In times of famine, siege, or exile, many people hid their last good thing. Sometimes it was grain, sometimes wine, but often, especially in the countryside, it was cheese. Why, say? Because cheese waits, it keeps, it ripens. It matures in silence, needing little more than time and darkness. It becomes better by not being touched. And so in times of desperation, one small wheel of cheese was often tucked away, not for sale, not for sharing, but as a symbol of survival, of hope, of something to come after. In some villages, these were called end wheels, cheeses wrapped in cloth tied with ribbons and hidden beneath floorboards or under altar stones. Not for eating during the crisis, but for when the crisis ended, to mark the return of life. Which brings us to tonight's peculiar detail. In a mountain town in southern France, a man survived a winter siege with nothing but root vegetables, river ice, and the memory of a cheese. Not the cheese itself, just the memory. He described it so vividly, so often, its scent, its softness, the way it felt on the back of the tongue, that others began to believe they had tasted it too. When spring came, they made it from memory. It wasn't the same, but it was enough. The woman at the market opens her box. Inside, resting on a clean linen square, is a single wedge of pale, slightly crumbling cheese. Blue-flecked, waxed at the edges, it smells like pine needles and old stone. She slices off the tiniest sliver and places it on a wooden spoon. For remembering, she says, "You taste. It's not amazing, not sweet, not bold, but it's familiar. Like something you forgot you once loved. Like something you had the night before something changed." She tells you then about her grandmother who kept a last cheese for the day her husband came home from war. He never did. She opened the cheese anyway, shared it with the village. They called it widow's cheese. And since then, every generation in her family keeps one locked away, gifted forward, never spoken of until needed. Just in case, a few quiet flakes of thought. In some traditions, cheese was placed in coffins, not as food, but as memory. A widow once wrote that cheese was the only thing that didn't speak but always stayed. A village in northern Italy celebrates Il giorno del formaggio perduto, the day of lost cheese. They unwrap aged wheels, share stories, and bury the rind as an offering to time. So tonight's question is this: when everything else is lost, does memory remain edible? Is it possible that taste so simple, so sensory, carries more of our story than we admit? And if so, what cheese are you saving? Not to eat. To remember. You leave the market just as the sea breeze picks up. The box is empty now, but your hands feel heavier than before. Not with food, with something older, quieter. You glance back once. She's locking the box again, but there's nothing inside. And still you understand why. You've come inland again. Away from salt, away from sails, into a region of meadows and millstones where the hills are gentle, the roads muddy, and the secrets old. You're walking along a path lined with willow trees, led by a boy no older than 12. He says little, only that she still makes the good ones and then spits into the grass like punctuation. After an hour, you arrive at a cottage shaped like memory itself. Thatched roof, leaning chimney garden filled with herbs and mismatched stones. And on the windowsill, cooling, are small rounds of cheese wrapped in linen and twine. You don't knock, the door is already open. Tonight's story is about the cheese witch of Thornfield Hollow, and how belief, fear, and butterfat once made a woman both sacred and cursed. She sits at the hearth when you enter, tall, bone-thin, with fingers stained by berries and smoke. She doesn't smile, but she doesn't blink either. "You're here for the story," she says. You nod. She points to a tray near the fire, 3 cheeses, each one different. One soft and white, almost trembling. One gray and hard, flaked with ash. One glowing faintly gold in the firelight. Each one does something she says, but only if you listen after eating. You pause. She cocks her head. You don't have to believe, just chew slow. You pick the soft one. It tastes like rain and wool and something green. She nods. That one remembers dreams. And so she begins. Here's your historical fact. In the late medieval period, women who made cheese, especially those who aged it using herbs, ash, or ritual, were sometimes accused of witchcraft. Not for poisoning, not even for fraud, for doing it too well. The line between healer and heretic was thin, and cheese, being alive, changeable, unpredictable, became one of the most contested crafts, especially when the cheese worked. Women like the one before you were called curd whisperers, those who could sense when milk was angry or when rennet had gone bitter. Some could charm the mold to grow in patterns. Others sang to their cheese wheels. Many were left alone. Some were not. The woman tells you of her grandmother who once cured a fever with blue-streaked cheese and fennel tea. The child lived. The priest frowned. That night someone burned her cheese cave. Not the house, just the cave. Because that's where the power was. Which brings us to tonight's odd detail. In certain rural regions, people believed that cheese could carry intentions. A wheel made with resentment would crack. One made with joy would bloom early. One made in secret. Well, no one agreed what it did, but they always remembered the taste. The woman offers you a slice of the gray cheese now. It tastes like stone pepper and fog. That one forgets, she says. You feel your shoulders loosen. Somewhere deep down, something unlatches. A few gentle observations before we drift. In some trial records, women defended their cheese by saying it curdled by the moon, not the devil. A popular charm read, turn once for love, turn twice for cure, turn thrice for cheese that brings sleep pure. A skeptical bishop once ate bewitched cheese to prove a point. He slept for 2 days and woke up speaking Flemish. So tonight's quiet question, were these cheese witches feared because of what they made or what people projected into the rind? Was it really magic? Or was it mastery misunderstood? You take the third cheese, the golden one. It tastes like honeyed hay and thunderclouds. Your eyes close just briefly. When you open them, the fire's gone low and the woman is gone. Only the cheeses remain still warm, still humming with memory. You step outside into the dark meadow, the wind lifting softly through the trees. Something has shifted. You don't know what. But you feel full of milk, of mystery, of stories that taste like truth. You've come to a village that doesn't appear on most maps. Not because it's hidden, though it feels that way, but because it was once erased. Forgotten. The kind of place that fell into ruin not from fire or plague, but from quiet. And yet, something kept it breathing. As you pass the faded gatepost and the empty stone fountain, a smell stops you in your tracks. Warm, toasted, tangy. Comforting in a way that feels like being remembered. You follow it to a modest cottage where a woman in her 60s tends a pan over a slow fire. The flames flicker. The roof leaks. But the air is filled with the unmistakable scent of cheese being fried. She sees you, nods once, says nothing. But she plates 2 pieces, sits. And so begins tonight's tale, the fried cheese of forgotten places, where food survives even when history lets go and where memory lingers in oil and crust. Let's start with your historical fact. In many parts of medieval Europe, fried cheese was a dish of both celebration and salvage. Peasants fried cheese when it was old, too hard to chew, or slightly spoiled. Nobles fried it in spices to impress guests. Monks fried it by accident during experiments. But everywhere fried cheese meant something survived long enough to be warmed again. Tonight's cheese is simple pressed curd, sliced thin, seared in goose fat. The crust is golden, the inside soft as candle wax. You take a bite. It crackles. It melts. It remembers. The woman speaks slowly. We fry it, she says, because it's the only way to wake it back up. She tells you the village once had a festival. Every spring. Music, hay tossing, long tables, dances that lasted until the wine ran dry. And every home served their version of fried cheese, round cubed, wrapped in leaves, crumbled over bread. Then came a war, a fire, a forgetting. Now only she makes it. Not for sale, not for show, but for continuity. Which brings us to tonight's quiet detail during times of hardship, plague, siege, famine. Many communities used fried foods to preserve dignity. Frying made poor cheese feel luxurious. It softened what was hard, crisped what was stale. It was a little defiant laugh in the face of decline. And so in villages like this, one fried cheese became more than a snack. It was resistance, a few golden crumbs of thought. Some villagers believed that cheese fried on a stormy day could trap lightning. This led to a short-lived dish called thunder curd. A wandering priest once called fried cheese the food of saints who refused to starve. He was invited to every table after that. In one forgotten cookbook, the only surviving recipe is titled, "Cheese, that which waits and crackles." The woman serves you another slice. You eat. It tastes braver. Which leads us to tonight's open-ended question: is survival about keeping the body alive or keeping rituals breathing? If a village disappears but one person still fries cheese the same way, has the place truly vanished? Or is it still here, curling softly in smoke and oil? You help her wash dishes. She hums a melody with no lyrics, and as you leave, she presses something into your palm. A small square of fried cheese wrapped in parchment. For the road, she says. For remembering. You walk back into the trees, the stars blinking through the branches. The village behind you fades, but in your pocket a bit of warmth remains. There's a monastery on the edge of a cliff. It's the kind of place people build when they're trying to escape the world, stone pressed against sky, wind so constant it becomes silence, and steps worn smooth by generations too weary to turn back. You've climbed those steps today, not for prayer, not for pilgrimage, but because you heard a whisper in a village tavern. They still serve storm cheese up there, and whatever that means, you had to find out. A monk greets you. His face looks like it was carved from driftwood. He says nothing, only gestures you inside through a long, narrow hall scented with beeswax, damp wool, and something faintly smoky. In the refectory, a simple meal is being served. Lentil soup, rough bread and cheese, but not in slices, in a bowl. Melted, yes, but not soft. It's thick, bubbling, glossy, like lava, or like the inside of a thought held too long. And so begins tonight's tale. Cheese in the time of siege, a story where food isn't just about survival, but endurance, defiance, and quiet hope. Let's begin with your historical fact. During medieval sieges in Europe, monasteries often became havens of culinary knowledge. Cut off from trade supplies, even morale monks turned inward spiritually and gastronomically. And that's when siege cheese was born, not made for pleasure, but for perseverance. Hardened rinds melted into soup, crumbs scraped from wooden shelves. Even mold was boiled and strained, believed to carry the memory of nutrients. They called it storm cheese, not for its flavor, but for its origin, war, hunger, cold. You take a spoonful. It tastes of smoke and time, and something deeply, quietly resilient. The monk beside you chews slowly. He doesn't nod at the taste, but at the fact that it exists. He tells you of the winter of 1349 when the monastery was under siege for 7 weeks. They lived on storm cheese and boiled parchment. The youngest monk passed. The oldest survived. When spring came, they didn't celebrate. They made cheese again. Not to eat, to remember. And that leads us to tonight's quiet detail. In some war-torn regions, cheese became a symbol of unfinished prayers. People hid wheels in stone walls, wrapped curds in verses, carved small crosses into the rind, not out of superstition, but reverence. A last bite, a sacred reserve. A few crumbs of reflection, one abbess wrote. Cheese softened by fire feeds not the belly, but the will. Some siege journals mention communal cheese-melting shared meals before long, uncertain nights. A dying monk once requested only a spoonful of rind and the sound of the storm. And here's your gentle, open-ended question. In times of hardship, is food merely fuel, or is it memory as melting cheese during a siege, not desperation, but devotion? You finish your bowl. It doesn't warm you, but it steadies you, as if something ancient just nodded. The monk clears the dishes. Candles flicker low. You step outside. The wind howls across the cliff, indifferent to your presence. But something inside you glows. Not joy, not hunger, something sturdier. The knowledge that even in ruin, someone still stirred the pot. The road winds through charred trees now. Not burned recently, this fire came decades ago. Maybe longer. But the trunks still remember. They stand like blackened ribs under a gray sky, and the wind sounds like something exhaled from long ago. You pass no houses, no travelers. Only a stone marker barely visible under moss carved with a single word, Rindgar. A place that once was, and apparently still is, because ahead, tucked into the hollow of a hill, is a single building. Stone walls, a red door, and smoke rising from a crooked chimney. Inside you find a man. Not a monk, not a merchant, just a man. Middle-aged, calloused hands, stirring something over a fire. "Come in," he says without turning. You're just in time for the dark cheese. You do not ask what that means. Not yet, because the smell hits you first. Sharp, earthy, fermented, alive, as if the cheese were made of things that grew under pressure roots, ash, silence. And so begins tonight's tale, the cheese that survived the fire, where food becomes witness, relic, and quiet resistance. Let's begin with your historical fact after catastrophic events, fires, invasions, plagues. Survivors often turn to cheese as a record. They didn't write about the losses, they preserved them. Some cheese wheels were stamped with dates, names, or prayers before being buried, aged, and unearthed only when a community had the strength or the reason to remember. They were not eaten. They were opened. It is much like this one. The man lifts a lid from a wooden box and removes a small, cracked wheel. It's dark brown, nearly black, wrapped in linen stained with soot. He cuts a slice. It crumbles at the edges but holds firm at the center, just like the people who made it. After the fire, he says there were 7 of us. We had goat's ash and memory. That's all. So they made this, not because they needed to eat, but because they needed to do something. Something slow, something gentle, something that would wait for them on the other side of grief. You take a bite. It's bitter, not unpleasant, just honest. It tastes like burnt hay, old wood, and a sweetness buried deep like something that survived the smoke. He doesn't smile, but he watches you closely. This is the last one, he says. We only made 10, 1 for each year we agreed to remember. You ask if he plans to make more. He shakes his head. We're still remembering. Which brings us to tonight's haunting detail. In several cultures, cheese was used in mourning rituals, not as food, but as presence. Left on graves, carried in processions, pressed into molds shaped like eyes, hands, even lungs to represent what had been lost and what remained. Some believed the aging of cheese mirrored the stages of grief. That mold was the visible work of healing. That cracks were proof of pressure endured, a few soft slices of thought. In Bohemia, a grief cheese was aged for 9 years, opened only on the 10th anniversary of a tragedy. It was never swallowed, only tasted. In some villages, children who died young had their names carved into cheese rinds, melted later into communal bread. One poem ends with the line, "Even fire cannot eat what we curdle with care." So here's your quiet question tonight. When memory is too heavy to speak, can cheese hold it for us? Can the act of aging something slowly, deliberately, silently be a form of mourning, of honoring, of enduring? You finish your slice. The man wraps the rest, hands it to you. For the next time you forget something worth remembering. You leave his cottage into a forest that is still recovering, and maybe always will be. But the smoke smells sweeter now, and the road, though cracked, still leads forward. There's a town square ahead, but no one's in it. Not because of war or plague or market day, simply because it's not time yet. The cobblestones gleam with dew. The sky is paper gray, and every door is shut, not locked, just waiting. There are garlands above windows, dried lavender tucked behind shutters, and a single table already set in the middle of the square. 1 stool, 1 plate, and on that plate a folded piece of cheese. Ugh. You've never seen anything like it. Not sliced. Not crumbled. Yeah, folded. Like parchment. Like a letter that hasn't been opened yet. And so begins tonight's story. The cheese that held a message where food was not only nourishment but communication. Sometimes coded, sometimes whispered, always folded carefully with intention. Here's your historical fact in the later Middle Ages. Folded cheeses, soft curds, gently creased into shapes, were used during festivals, ceremonies, and in some regions, private correspondence. Yes, cheese as a letter. Why? Because parchment was expensive. Paper was rare. And sometimes you couldn't write at all either because you didn't know how or because words would betray you. So you used cheese. Cheese could be flavored, shaped, even layered. A sour taste, regret. A honey-sweetened fold, love. Ash in the center, warning. The folding technique mattered too. One corner tucked, I miss you. Two corners wrapped tight, it's over. Three corners bent into a triangle, meet me after sunset. Come alone. Ridiculous, maybe. But so is singing to mold, and yet we did that too. The cheese on the table now is square, thin, folded once across the middle like a closed palm. You don't open it. Yet, the woman who arrives does. She's old. Older than stone. She wears a cloak the color of acorns and carries a small tin box. This was for you, she says, pointing to the cheese. You ask from whom? She says simply, the person you forgot. Which brings us to tonight's curious detail. In several alpine communities, cheese messages were passed between lovers, conspirators, even rival cheese guilds. Flavored, folded, infused. One love story tells of a man who sent his beloved folded cheese rounds every year on the anniversary of their first kiss, each one flavored with something she once said she liked. The year he died, the last one arrived with only one flavor ash. It was folded inward, a final goodbye. A few quiet crumbs of wonder in eastern France. Triple folds meant come in peace, used when entering towns after long absences. Some folded cheeses were aged between pages of books to learn the language of memory. A cheese folded wrong or too hastily was considered a social offense equal to forgetting someone's name. So here's your gentle question tonight. Are we always trying to say something that words cannot hold? When you offer someone a dish or a slice or a carefully folded curd, are you feeding them? Or telling them something? You unfold the cheese. Inside there's nothing hidden. Just soft white curd and a hint of sage. But the taste reminds you, not of a person, of a moment, something you lost track of long ago. A feeling, a choice, a winter night when you said nothing and wished you had. You fold the cheese back, set it on the plate, and the woman nods as if to say message received. You leave the square just as the town begins to stir. Doors creak open, someone hums. A child runs past you chasing a wheel of wood. Life continues, but you walk slower now. Not from weariness, but from a sense that something is ending. Not collapsing, not vanishing, just folding in on itself. Like a cheese. Like a memory. Like a message you didn't know you were carrying all along. Tonight the moon rises before the sun has fully gone. It casts silver across the valley, milk light over fields of barley, roofs of moss, and winding rivers that seem to hum beneath their own breath. You're walking a road that doesn't seem to end or begin, just a path between things, and at its center a hill, and on that hill a tree, and under that tree a table. It's not a feast, it's a memory. One place, one plate, one piece of cheese with a candle stuck in the middle, burning low but steady. This is not dinner. It's a ritual. Tonight's story is the birthday cheese, where food was not about hunger, but about marking time, identity, and the soft, strange act of being remembered. Here's your historical fact. In several pockets of rural medieval Europe, people did not celebrate birthdays with cake. They used cheese. Why? Because cheese aged with you. It changed shape, texture, strength. It absorbed its environment. It carried marks, cracks, mold, and softness, all of which told a story. Just like you. In some communities, parents made a fresh cheese on the day their child was born. They'd age it slowly, carefully, flipping it once a season, washing it with herbs, tucking it in cloth embroidered with blessings. At age 7, the child would be allowed a bite. At 14, a second slice. At 21, the rest. Unless it spoiled, or unless it didn't. You sit at the table beneath the tree staring at the candlelit cheese. It's hard, cracked, wrapped in linen that smells of juniper and something older. The note beside it reads, "Turn it over." You do. Etched on the bottom in shaky ink is a date. Not yours, someone else's. You wait, and a man arrives. He's tall, quiet, wears a tunic the color of tree bark. He doesn't greet you. He just sits. 73 today, he says, nodding toward the cheese. You ask gently, "Is it yours?" He smiles. "No, my brother's. But he died before he turned 7. My mother still made the cheese. Said she'd carry his aging for him. And she did. Every year she flipped it, blessed it, sang to it. Now he does the same. He would have liked time," he says, placing a sprig beside the wheel. He hated goat's milk. But this one's goat. She made it anyway. Called it stubborn memory. Which brings us to tonight's remarkable detail. Some aging cheeses were considered people. Not metaphorically. Literally. Named. Tracked. Given corners of the house, talked to, mourned when they spoiled, celebrated when they endured. A wheel might be called Fifth Daughter, Little Winter, or Joan's Last Promise. They were edible biographies. You ask if he'll eat it. He shakes his head. Not yet. I'm not ready to remember all of him at once. Instead, he breaks off a tiny piece, places it at the base of the tree. For the animals, he says, or the ghosts. Let's pause with a few gentle slices of thought. In one Welsh village, every child had a cradle cheese aged alongside them, buried at marriage. A midwife once recorded that twins required 2 cheeses or one split at birth and rejoined at death. A superstition said that if your cheese cracked before your 16th year, it meant you'd leave home early. So here's your question tonight. When we age something beside us, whether it's a book, a coat, a cheese, are we really preserving it? Or are we just marking time, quietly admitting we too are ripening? The man stands, lights another candle. One to replace the one that's nearly gone. Would you like a bite? He asks, motioning to the wheel. You hesitate, then say softly, "Not tonight." He nods. Me neither. You both sit in silence a while longer, listening to the wind move through barley and bone, through story and rind. When you leave, the hill doesn't seem so high, and the moon still bright feels less like a watcher and more like an old friend, one who remembers your taste, even if you've forgotten your name. There's a fog tonight that clings to your ankles like a pet, soft, damp, familiar, like stepping into a memory you didn't know you had. The path beneath you disappears every few steps, reappears like a thought returning. You follow it anyway, not toward a village, not toward a house, but toward a bell, faint metallic swinging somewhere ahead, though there's no tower in sight. Eventually you find it, not the bell, a cart, wooden, lopsided, parked beside a narrow stream. And on top of it, covered in linen and herbs, are bundles of cheese. All the same shape, all the same color, all the same smell, sour, bright, alive. A man emerges from behind the cart holding a small knife and a book with no title. Pick one, he says. You ask, what kind are they? He shrugs. That depends who you've lost. Tonight's story is about the traveling mourner's cart, where cheese became a tool of collective remembrance, passed not from hand to hand, but from grief to grief. Here's your historical fact. In the 13th and 14th centuries, itinerant merchants weren't always selling salt or thread. Some carried mourning cheeses, rounds made specifically for families in grief who had no kitchens left. The cheeses were plain, salted just enough to keep, wrapped in herbs, tied with black thread. They were never sold, only exchanged for names, prayers, or silence. Some said they were made from shared tears. That's not poetic. It's literal. One Flemish tradition asked the grieving to rinse the curds with water gathered from their own weeping. A symbolic act, yes, but taken seriously. It infused the cheese with presence. You pick one from the cart. The man unwraps it, slices it slowly, offers a piece. It crumbles in your hand like dry snow. Tastes like lemon rind, mint, and something unfinished. He nods. That one's for people who left without saying goodbye. You ask what the others mean. He opens the book, inside hand-drawn maps. Not of cities, of emotions. Each cheese has a page. This one, he says, pointing to a spiral, is for regret too late to name. This gesturing to one covered in nettles is for those we wish we'd feared less. And this a pale square is for the ones who were almost ours. Which brings us to tonight's haunting detail. Some communities made cheese specifically to remember unnamed losses, loves that never happened, children that never came, homes that never got built. They called them ghost cheeses. They were eaten in silence, often beside rivers, thrown into fire afterward, never saved. A few soft echoes of thought. In Brittany, mourners once left cheese at crossroads to feed wandering sorrow. Some said that if the rind cracked in the shape of a heart, the dead had accepted your goodbye. A cheese left untouched at the end of a vigil was sometimes buried with the deceased, or eaten by the youngest mourner to carry the grief forward. So tonight's question, can food hold space for pain we cannot explain? Can a slice say, I remember? Even when the words aren't there, you finish the piece. He wraps the rest in cloth. It's for later, he says. Sometimes the second bite is braver. You thank him. He nods not unkindly. And as the cart vanishes behind you into the fog bell, still swinging though you never see it, you feel lighter. Not because grief is gone, but because you've shared it quietly. And someone folded it into something you could carry. And maybe one day, finish. Tonight you follow music. Not the kind that dances, it limps. Stumbles. A reedy sort of tune played on a bone flute or a pipe carved from elderwood, threading its way through the hills like a sound trying to remember its own name. You're not sure when it started, only that you couldn't not follow it. It leads you to a clearing, not empty. A circle of people, quiet, seated, no one speaks. In the center a fire, and balanced above it, turning slowly on an iron spit, not meat, but cheese. Dripping, crisping, melting into the embers like candle wax. One woman looks up and nods. You're just in time for the silence. You sit. And so begins tonight's story, the cheese that was never spoken, of a story about secrecy, ritual, resistance. And how in certain corners of the medieval world, cheese was not served but shared in silence to say the unsayable. Let's begin with your historical fact during periods of oppression and suspicion. Times of occupation, persecution, or betrayal. Many communities turned to food not just for survival, but for communication. When words were dangerous, food became code, and in some places, cheese took on this role. In one 14th century Italian village, a certain grilled cheese, rubbed with sage and blackened at the edges, was passed at dusk between families accused of harboring dissenters. It was called the uncut wheel. No knives were used. You only broke it by hand. If someone offered you a piece and you accepted, it meant I know. I remember. I'm with you. No records, just crumbs. Tonight's cheese is similar. Firm, smoked, edges crisped over open flame. It smells of wood salt and something almost medicinal, juniper maybe, or secret keeping. No one explains the rules, but you watch. When it's ready, the wheel is set onto a flat stone in the center of the group. One by one, people tear small pieces, always the same size, always with the same hand. No one eats right away. You mimic the gesture. When your turn comes, you take a piece. Warm, sharp, slightly bitter, like something that used to be sweet but had to grow up. No one speaks. No one chews loudly. And yet, so much is being said, which brings us to tonight's remarkable detail. In parts of medieval Bohemia and southern Germany, gatherings like these were real. Called cheese circles, they were informal councils, emotional, spiritual, and political. Hosted in barns, ruined cellars. Some lasted 10 minutes, others until the cheese was gone. It wasn't about solutions. It was about witnessing. One chronicler wrote, to share the burnt edge is to say, I saw it too. I still carry it. A few quiet thoughts folded into rind. A rebellion in 1432 began with a cheese wheel rolled down a hill. It cracked. That was the signal. In one convent, forbidden books were hidden in hollowed-out cheese rinds. Read only when the scent changed. A coded message once read, bring the cheese with 3 corners missing. It meant the danger is near but not inside. So here's your question tonight when the world asks for silence but your heart still aches. Can food speak on your behalf? Can a bite shared in the dark say more than a cry? The fire is low now. The wheel is nearly gone, but everyone stays seated a moment longer, letting the final warmth of the shared cheese linger not on the tongue, but somewhere deeper. You rise quietly. Someone presses the last crumb into your palm. You don't need to ask what it means. You already know. It means you're not alone, and for tonight that's enough. Tonight you walk along the edge of something. Not a cliff, not a river. Something less visible but more present, like the border between two stories. One remembered, one never told. The trees grow thinner here, the stars seem closer, and the wind doesn't howl, it listens. You come upon a house with no windows, only a door, and beside that door a table. On it a single round cheese, and carved into its rind like a gravestone or a seal are 5 letters. N-O-M-O-R. Not a word, not a name, just a marking. You knock. The door creaks open. A woman answers, cloaked eyes steady. You've come for the ritual cheese, she says. You don't know how she knows, but you nod and step inside. Tonight's story is about the ritual cheese of remembrance when dairy was not just food, but a ceremony rooted in grief survival and the fragile act of trying again. Here's your historical fact: in certain borderland regions of medieval Europe, places often caught between kingdoms, languages, and wars, people developed rituals involving cheese not as meals but as memorials. Not for the dead, for the nearly forgotten, those lost not to death but to history. A village wiped out by fire, a name erased from a ledger, a child who never made it to their own wedding. You sit at the hearth. The woman unwraps the cheese. It's thick, dense, speckled with herbs that have no name in Latin. Carved faintly along its edges are lines, scratches really, but deliberate. She slices it, doesn't speak, places one wedge before you, one before herself. The rest goes back into its cloth. You eat the first bite, she says, for what you remember. You chew. It tastes of earth, parsley, thyme. The second, she says, for what you were never told. You swallow. It's bitter, smoky, unsettling. The third, she says, for what must remain forgotten. You hesitate, then eat. And somehow it tastes sweet, but not sugar, peace. Which brings us to tonight's strange and beautiful detail. No more was the word used in parts of Wallachia and Hungary to describe a person not remembered but not gone. Neither ghost nor ancestor. Just held. And the cheese used in these rituals was designed to hold space. Aged precisely 37 days. Salted with ash from 3 types of wood. Tied with red thread, never white. It was eaten slowly, quietly, by candlelight, then buried or offered to the wind, a few soft echoes of ritual. Some said if you dropped the ritual cheese while eating, the memory would return in dreams. Others believed that eating too much of it could make you forget your own name. A priest once refused to bless the cheese. The villagers gave it a name anyway, Father Silence. So here's your whispered question: can ritual feed what history cannot? When facts fade, when names dissolve, can flavor, texture, shared breath across a wooden table keep someone known? You finish. The woman stands, wraps what's left. She places the rest in your hands. Find someone who's lost something, she says. Share only one bite. You step outside. The door closes. The stars are still there, but they seem quieter now, as if listening for names not yet spoken. And maybe, just maybe, they'll wait for you to speak them. With bread, with cheese, with kindness. Dawn lifts like a slow-moving curtain, unveiling a meadow just outside a crumbling border fortress. Dew beads on every blade of grass, sparking miniature constellations under the early light. You stand at the edge of the field with a handful of curious onlookers, squires, half-buttoned into gambesons' laundresses, still clutching damp linens, and one very confused falcon who keeps tilting his head at the scene below. 2 knights face one another at 20 paces. No swords, no maces. Just cheese. Each holds a platter lined with thin, chilled slices of hard cow's milk cheese. You can see steam ribboning faintly from their breath, but not from the dairy. The slices glint yellow-white edges sharp where a kitchen boy's knife worked overtime in the torchlit hours before dawn. A herald steps forward, unfurls a scroll, and recites charges so quietly you barely catch the words. Slander, insolence, the unlawful warming of another man's cheese. The last offense earns a hiss from the small crowd. In this border province that's practically treason, the herald lifts a hand. On the call, you will cast 5 slices apiece. Should neither yield, you may proceed to the 6th, which is melted. His voice drops as if invoking something solemn. May justice and curd be served. And so begins a duel by dairy proof that in the medieval world even honor could be measured in degrees of Fahrenheit. You breathe in the scene slowly. Every exhale feels like a quiet drumbeat against your ribs. The knights raise their platters. Scribes dip quills into inkwells. A young servant produces a brazier and a small clay pan ready to melt the sudden death slice if the score remains even. A common historical fact. Judicial duels trial by combat were a recognized if theatrical method of settling disputes across medieval Europe. Most involved steel, but food duels existed on the fringes, bread against bread for millers, ale against ale for brewwives, and in at least 5 documented instances, cheese against cheese. One 1394 record from Westphalia describes a knight who claimed another had stolen his cheese recipe. They fought with blunted spears dipped in curd until the rightful owner's provolone bested the pretender's Gouda. The first volley. The elder knight, Sir Aldemar of the 3 Towers, cocks his wrist and flings his slice. It sails thin and fast, slapping Sir Hugo's pauldron with a remarkably loud clack. Gouged cheese shards flutter like pale confetti. Murmurs ripple through the spectators. Sir Hugo answers in kind. His slice arcs high, catches a breeze, and smacks Aldemar's helmet, leaving a smear of fat on polished steel. 1-1. They reload. Quirky detail. Chivalric manuals mention courtesy weights for edible missiles. A dueling cheese slice had to be no heavier than 2 beans of silver to ensure fairness. In practice, combatants often trimmed edges thinner than parchment. Chronicles complain that duels of dairy do grind the cook's patience to dust. Imagine being the kitchen hand who must shave 50 perfect slices, knowing each could settle a lawsuit. After the 3rd exchange, both knights show splatters of dairy pride across breastplates. Sir Hugo's squire dabs at a glob sliding down to the belt. Sir Aldemar grunts, flexes a gauntlet, and checks his remaining ammunition. You notice townsfolk placing quiet wagers, a dried apple here, a tin button there. No coin changes hands. Cheese courts are about reputation, not riches. They fling slice 4. It strikes shield edge to shield edge in midair, shattering into golden dust that drifts like summer dandelion fluff. The crowd gasps as sunlight catches the particulate, turning breakfast protein into glitter. Slice 5 whistles through the still cool air. Sir Aldemar's hit's knee plate clings and sizzles faintly where it contacts warmed metal. Sir Hugo's just misses kissing past Aldemar's ear and landing in the grass with a damp plop. 5 volleys, Aldemar leads 3-2, but by custom the duel must finish the set or escalate. The herald signals the brazier forward. The clay pan already hosts one final slice, thick and ridged with firm rennet veins. A squire ladles coals beneath. Soon the cheese softens, bubbles, turns glossy like molten gold. 3 light jokes to break the tension. You've heard of Swiss with holes. This is Swiss with goals. Nothing says I respect you like slapping someone across the visor with dairy. At least if they lose their temper, there's fondue for everyone. The herald announces sudden death. The molten slice will be flung with a wooden spatula. Whoever lands it upon the visor or heart plate without it sliding off wins absolute judgment. Sir Hugo behind on points claims first turn. The spatula trembles in his grip. Strings of cheese stretch like sleepy sunrise. He swings forward, it slips, spatters across Sir Aldemar's left arm guard, but most of it splashes harmlessly down. The crowd releases a collective sigh. Aldemar steps to the brazier, loads the second molten portion, nods once to the heavens, as if requesting windless air, and flings. Time slows. The gooey mass arcs low, spins, and lands square on Hugo's chest. It sticks. Steam rises, a perfect hit. Cheers erupt. Children bounce. The confused falcon screeches approval. Aldemar bows stiffly. Sir Hugo kneels, partly in pain. Molten cheese is still hot and partly in concession. He unbuckles a small purse from his belt and hands it over. Customary damages, not coins, but a recipe. Such duels often demanded surrender of secret spicing ratios or rennet blends. Intellectual property, medieval edition. Open-ended academic question: were cheese duels merely colorful outliers? Or did they reveal deeper anxieties about culinary patents in a world before copyright? Scholars debate. Some see ritualized edibility as the safe outlet of aristocratic rivalry. Others argue it symbolized the burgeoning economic value of distinctive regional foods, proto-branding, if you will. In a society where your identity hinged on land and lineage, controlling a cheese recipe could be as socially potent as a coat of arms. The herald raises hands for silence. Judgment rendered, honor satisfied. Let the field be cleared and the cheese be eaten, that no ill will linger beyond the rind. Squires rush forward, collecting fragments into wooden bowls. Someone sets a pot of wine to mull with spiced peel and cinnamon. Soon the meadow smells of toasted curd and cloves, an aroma so comforting it erases any notion of insult. You accept a bowlful of broken slices. They taste faintly of meadow herbs and metal polish, flavors of conflict mellowing into lunch. As you chew, you muse that dairy can wound, but it can also heal. The same fat that slapped a knight's pride now coats tongues, reminding everyone that victory and defeat alike pass through the stomach and become stories. The falcon finally flaps away, bored. The dew dries. Grass bears yellow smears like abstract art. And somewhere in the next valley, travelers will hear rumor of the day cheese flew like arrows and justice melted on armor. You smile because you were here. And tonight, when you drift into sleep, perhaps you'll feel the faint echo of that molten slice, hot, bright, absurd, sailing across dawn's first light. The road tonight smells of apples. Not fresh ones, but old, soft-skinned, spotted, almost translucent with age. They line the ditches like forgotten offerings, their skins wrinkled as old monks, and their scent clinging to the air like a memory gone sweet from waiting too long. You follow the smell. It leads to a barn. Half-collapsed door, swinging roof like a toothless grin. And inside, hanging from beams like sleepy bats, are bundles wrapped in waxed linen. You step closer. Not bats. Not bread. Cheese. But not round. Not square. Spindle-shaped. Wrapped in dried apple leaves. Tied with straw. Stamped with a mark, a small spiral like a snail. Or the swirl of wind on water. A figure appears in the shadows, older than the barn, perhaps eyes bright beneath a veil of soot. You're here for the dreamer's cheese, she says. Of course you are. Tonight's story is the cheese that waited to be eaten, an odd and fragrant chapter in the culinary traditions of the late medieval world, where patience wasn't just a virtue but an ingredient. Here's your historical fact. Some rural cheesemakers, especially in late medieval France and the Low Countries, believed that cheese improved not only with time but with intention. These were not cheeses to be eaten daily or even seasonally. They were made to wait for a story, a moment, a reunion, a revelation, a dream remembered. They were called fromages, dormant, sleeping cheeses, and they were usually made from milk gathered on the first day of spring rain, flavored with fermented apple peels and wrapped in cloth inked with a symbol of the moon's phase. The woman removes one of the cheeses from the rafter. She holds it to her ear, listens, then nods. This one's ready, she says. You don't ask how she knows. Shalem. She hands it to you. Warm, damp, smelling of cider hay and something slightly like lavender if lavender were tired. She slices it with a bone-handled knife. Inside a marbled pattern, white and gold, with veins of pale blue. She doesn't explain the pattern. She just says eat it while thinking of something you lost. If it tastes bitter, it's not ready. If it tastes sour, it was never meant for you. But if it tastes like bread... She pauses. You'll know. You take a bite. It tastes like, not bread, but crust, toasted with honey and a little smoke. You close your eyes. You remember that, not what was lost, but how it left. A door you didn't close. A letter you didn't send. A promise softened into silence. And it's okay. Because the cheese remembers for you. Quirky detail. In some villages, these cheeses were kept on high shelves for exactly 7 years. If unopened, they were buried beneath apple trees. If opened too soon, they were said to bring restless dreams, visions of missed trains, unmapped forests. People knocking at doors you never built. One manuscript from Bruges described a woman who fed dream cheese to her cat every full moon, convinced it would help her find a lost sister. The cat never spoke, but it once dropped a mouse shaped like a boot onto her bed. She wept for hours. The woman serves you tea spiced with clove, thick with dried apple skin. She talks softly now, as if afraid the barn will wake. These cheeses, she says, were made for nights like this. When the body is quiet, but the mind is too full. They soften the inside. They sponge up the ache. You ask how long she's been here. She shrugs. Since the last comet or the first tooth I lost. Time melts. You look around. The barn smells of patience. The kind that takes years to steep. It feels like a waiting room for forgotten feelings. And somehow you don't mind waiting here. Because waiting is part of the flavor. Light jokes to let the moment breathe. Most people age wine. Only the bold age their cheese and their grudges. This is the only food that politely tells you not yet. If your snack requires lunar charts and emotional readiness, you're probably medieval or just very dramatic. Academic debate. Were dream cheeses genuinely part of culinary culture, or do they represent a folkloric intersection between superstition and seasonal food preservation? Some argue they were spiritual placebos, comfort food imbued with myth. Others suggest they were used in seasonal festivals where dreams and harvests were seen as cyclical reflections of one another. Is flavor memory? Is cheese a diary you eat? The spiral stamp might say yes. You wrap the rest of the cheese in its linen, feeling the fabric warmed by your hands. The woman gives you a look, not sad, not expectant, just knowing. She says, don't finish it all at once. You promise you won't. You leave the barn with the bundle under your arm, a little heavier than it should be, but not in a bad way. Outside, the apples glisten. The morning is coming, and the cheese, still warm, seems to hum with a story you haven't finished telling. Yet, tonight the wind speaks Latin, not the formal kind. No orations or scrolls, just murmurs, loose vowels, drifting across hills like monks who've lost their sandals but not their prayers. You follow the sound and it leads you to an orchard. Or what used to be one. The trees are thin, many broken. Their bark is carved with strange symbols, some crosses, some spirals, some equations. A boy stands nearby. He wears a robe far too large, cinched at the waist with a belt made of cheese rinds, dried, curled, polished like leather. He doesn't speak. He just gestures toward a stone table half buried in moss. On it, a plate. On the plate, a triangle of cheese so translucent you can see through it. This is tonight's story, the monastic cheese that knew too much. A tale of knowledge, edible secrecy, and the absurd but very real intersection between cheese and philosophy in the late medieval world. Here's your historical fact. During the 12th and 14th centuries, monasteries weren't just centers of prayer, they were data hubs, where information was preserved encrypted and in some cases encoded into unusual mediums, including food. There are recorded instances, especially in northern Italy and parts of Aquitaine, where monks developed digestible memory aids. These included sweetened wafers with scribed mnemonic symbols and, yes, cheese rounds used to teach cosmology. They called it Caseus arcanum hidden cheese. The boy lifts the triangle, holds it to the moonlight, and you see it etched into its delicate glassy body are lines like constellations. Maps of stars or logic trees. He hands it to you. It feels like old parchment, cold, waxy. You hesitate. He nods. So you bite. It crackles. Tastes like pine smoke time and ink. No, not ink. But your mind pulls at something. A shape. A name. A question you thought you'd forgotten. And then it arrives. Not an answer, but a need to ask. Quirky detail. Some Benedictine monks believed the mouth was a holy conduit. What entered it could influence thought. Thus, foods designed for mental awakening became a monastic obsession. A 1282 manuscript from Albi describes a cheese blended with dried marigold juniper ash and river salt believed to thin the veil between seen and unseen. It was often eaten during vigils alongside readings from both scripture and scientific texts. A cheese that didn't just nourish but interrogate. The boy points at the moss. Letters begin to appear. Not carved, not painted, just rising dew-wet from the stone. Quid manet post gustum? What remains after the taste? You don't answer. Because something does remain. A sliver of curiosity. A sensation that your thoughts are not your own but a script you've been chosen to complete. And the cheese is the prompt. 3 soft jokes to balance the tone. Who needs books when your snack can teach you Latin and existential dread? Say cheese, but only if you're ready for an internal monologue on mortality. Technically, this was the first brain food and possibly the last that tasted like mossy candlelight. You take another bite. It tastes slightly different now. Sharper, saltier. The flavor profile changes as your thoughts shift. As if the cheese knows what you're wondering. Or maybe it is your wondering. The boy takes what's left and carefully wraps it in a cloth embroidered with a labyrinth. This, he says at last, is why some monasteries never sold their cheese. You ask why. He answers because it didn't belong to mouths. It belonged to questions. And then he vanishes. Open-ended academic debate. Was this truly cheese as a mnemonic tool, or were monks layering spiritual metaphor onto culinary coincidence? Some scholars argue that so-called philosophers' cheeses were simply unique aged curds used to impress visitors. Others believe they were part of a liturgical performance turning consumption into meditation. Is knowledge better when tasted? And if a cheese makes you remember something you've never known, is it teaching or reminding? You carry the cloth-wrapped triangle with you, not for hunger, but because it feels like the only book you've ever needed. Tonight you won't sleep because you're tired. You'll sleep because your mind needs time to digest. And in the quiet hum of your resting breath, that last bite of translucent cheese will dissolve, leaving behind only one thing. A question you're finally ready to ask. The sun is nowhere. Not behind a cloud, not hiding behind trees. Just absent. And that's fine, because tonight you walk not by light, but by smell. A rich, dark, creamy scent that rises from underground like a secret trying to stay warm. You follow your nose through a stone archway carved into a hill. The air changes cooler, denser, wrapped in the sharp tang of fermented cream and echoing hymns. You're in a cave, or maybe a vault. You hear voices not chanting, not singing, just breathing gently synchronized. And then torchlight flickers, revealing monks seated in a perfect circle. At their center, a pedestal. And on the pedestal, a single wheel of butter pale as morning fog. Tonight's tale is the cave where butter never melted, a soft-spoken mystery about holy refrigeration, ritual refrigeration, and why some medieval orders treated butter not as food but as proof of faith. Here's your historical fact in several monastic communities, especially in the Pyrenees and Carpathian regions. Natural cave systems were used not only to store perishable goods, but to test the spiritual balance of the environment. Butter left in these caves was believed to take on the tone of the year sweet in peaceful times, sour in conflict and bitter if buried with unresolved sins. Some monasteries even refused to churn if the cave's last butter had turned rancid without cause. A monk rises. He wears linen robes dusted in flour. He does not speak. He places a knife carved from bone beside the butter wheel, then steps back. You are invited forward. The air around the butter is strangely still, as if even wind holds its breath. You slice into it. It resists, not from cold, but from memory. The butter is thick, almost cheese-like in consistency. It's been aged, though no one knows how, or how long. You lift a piece to your lips. It tastes sweet, like rain-soaked bread, with a whisper of salt and a silence you can chew. Quirky detail. One surviving monastic text from 1311 describes how the Wheel of Silence, as it was called, was served only during vow ceremonies, eaten in absolute quiet. No swallowing noises, no cutlery. Just breath and butter. It was believed that if the butter sang on your tongue, produced even the faintest sense of sound, you were not yet ready to keep your vow. Butter in this ritual wasn't indulgence. It was discernment. The monks pass you a bowl of barley tea, unflavored, warm, almost forgettable. Perfect contrast. You notice no one looks at you while you eat. They look at the butter as if it's remembering something through you. When you finish, one monk takes what's left, seals it in waxed cloth, and places it gently into a carved recess in the wall among dozens of others. Each cloth is embroidered with the year. The earliest you can see, 892. 3 gentle jokes to stir your smile. Who knew the quietest thing in the room could also be the richest? Monastic butter, it won't raise your voice, but it might raise your standards. You've heard of salted butter, now meet soul-filtered butter. A bell chimes softly. The monks rise in unison. They bow not to you, but to the butter. Then file out robes, swishing torches dimming. You remain alone with the aging wheel and the faint hum of stillness becoming flavor. Open-ended academic question: was cave-aged butter truly spiritual? Or was it simply practical dairy preservation romanticized by centuries of religious ritual? Some historians argue that the butter's role as memory food made it a tool for meditation. Others believe the entire ritual was a psychological palate cleanser, a way to reset before making big vows, confessions, or decisions. Can a bite of something so simple carry the weight of meaning? And more importantly, should it? You step out into the night again. The stars have returned, but they feel different now. Like quiet eyes watching to see if you understood what the butter meant. You don't know yet, but you feel ready. And that the monks would say is exactly the flavor you were supposed to taste. You walk now through a forest, but not the kind with birdsong and sun-dappled trails. No, this one is hushed. The trees are straight, tall, and packed tightly like sentinels or columns in a forgotten basilica. Their bark is dark, slick with dew, and the air smells faintly of wood smoke and thyme. There is no path, only a rhythm. The sound of frying, soft, steady, impossibly far and impossibly near. You follow it, through ferns, through fog, until the trees part to reveal a clearing. In its center, a cart. Smoke rises from a pan suspended above a low fire. It crackles, then sizzles, then pauses like it's listening for something. And at the cart's side, turning the handle of a battered press, stands a woman wrapped in linen, her apron dusted with flour and ash. Hungry, she asks without turning. You nod. You don't even care what's cooking. It smells like warmth, like crisis turned edible. This is tonight's tale, the fry cart that came only in hard times. A story of wandering vendors, emergency snacks, and how the medieval world knew when a village was in trouble. By the scent of fritters, your historical fact in times of war, famine, or local unrest. Certain traveling cooks, mostly women and widows, would arrive in struggling towns offering fried comfort food. These weren't just opportunists, they were part of an unspoken relief network. Their arrival signaled that a place had reached a point of emotional or social depletion. The fry carts were quiet, mobile kitchens of solidarity. You couldn't always afford a meal, but you could afford a bite. The woman drops a batter-wrapped bundle into the oil. It hisses. The smell is instant onions, herbs, a hint of dried apple. Crisis fritters, she says. Mostly root scraps, some barley dust, and hope. She smiles wryly. It's the hope that binds it together. She flips it with a slotted spoon. You take a seat on a nearby log and watch as oil bubbles like tiny gold bells. Heard this quirky detail. These crisis carts became so common during the 100 Years' War that certain towns left iron nails embedded in stone walls used to hang cauldrons for passing cooks. In some places, a nail was seen as a sign of both need and welcome. One Flemish proverb even said, "He who keeps an iron nail keeps a village fed." Sometimes, instead of coin, customers paid with gossip songs or fragments of cloth. One 15th century receipt simply reads, "One story well told, one fritter well browned." The fritter is handed to you on a leaf. It's blistered golden crispy at the edge, soft in the middle. You bite. It's humble, but satisfying. The outside is whisper thin and shatters between your teeth. The inside is dense but not heavy. There's something sweet in it. Pear skin, old honey. You're not sure, but your heart slows down. Your shoulders lower. You feel less like a traveler and more like someone held. The cook ladles more batter. Others arrive. A man with a burned boot. A child with no shoes. An old woman with eyes sharp as needles. No one speaks, but everyone eats. 3 soft jokes to lighten the broth. When the kingdom crumbles, the fritters rise. Medieval survival tip: never trust a castle without a snack cart nearby. These fritters can't solve your problems, but they can keep you too full to complain. You help stir the pot for a while. The woman nods at your grip. "You've done this before," she says. Not a question. You're not sure how to answer, but you know she's right. Because somewhere in your past, or someone else's, you've held a ladle on a cold night trying to make the most of flour, salt, and fear. The cart bears no insignia, no name, no price. But it doesn't need one. The scent is the signal. The food is the message. And the message is, you're not alone. Open-ended academic question. Were crisis fritters purely culinary improvisation? Or did they represent an emotional infrastructure as important as walls or markets? Historians debate whether these carts were proto-social services, expressions of gendered labor resilience, or symbols of communal memory. Can a fritter be a monument? And if it vanishes after being eaten, is it any less sacred? The last fritter sizzles to a close. The woman wraps the pan in cloth, lowers the flame, and wipes her hands on her apron. She doesn't say goodbye. She just wheels the cart forward, disappearing between trees that seem wider now, gentler. You watch her go. The scent of fried root lingers like a hymn for those without chapels. You stand slowly, not full, but fortified. And as the forest closes behind you, you realize the only way to thank her is simple. The next time the world wobbles, you'll cook. So here we are, friend. 30 pieces of a single story. Cheeses of grief, of hope, of bitter humor and quiet resolve. Fritters and mystery pies, butter wheels, and ghostly wedges carved with forgotten moons. Some you tasted, some you only imagined. All of them were real. And not because they were perfectly documented, but because they mattered. Someone waited. Someone cooked. Someone remembered. And now you've walked with them. You've stirred their pots, carried their bundles, stood beneath their archways. And in doing so, you've honored their flavor. Not with grand monuments, but with stillness, with breath, with the courage to keep listening when history speaks softly. So tonight, as your body sinks deeper into comfort and your mind begins to float, may you carry these stories not in your memory, but in your marrow. Because history isn't just in books. It's in banquets, in rituals, in the cheese you weren't supposed to eat but did anyway. And that's the story for tonight. May your dreams be filled with wonder and peace. There is a door ahead. Not wooden, not stone, just air. A doorway made from hanging threads, dozens of linen strips dyed with herbs and ashes fluttering like whispers in a language only kitchens remember. You part them gently, and find yourself in a courtyard lit by dusk. Candles balance in carved turnips. Steam curls from baskets, and in the center, arranged on a long table beneath a faded tapestry, are 30 cheeses. each different, each labeled not with names but with moments. When the storm passed, after the confession, the day she smiled, and the one at the end. Because we survived. Tonight's story is the final cheese, and it's not just about dairy. It's about memory craft love and how medieval people used flavor not only to preserve food but to preserve themselves. Your historical fact: in certain abbeys and remote villages, there was a tradition of preparing a single wheel of cheese at the end of each crisis. Not while starving or hiding or running, but after, when the dust had settled, when the bodies were buried, when someone finally sang again. These cheeses weren't eaten immediately. They were aged sometimes for decades, and they were eaten only during the next crisis, shared quietly, sometimes with tears, sometimes with laughter as a reminder that survival had a flavor. They called it requiem cheese. You take a seat. Someone hands you a knife, and the wheel labeled "because we survived." The rind is cracked. The wax is dark like bark after rain. You cut. It sighs. A long, slow exhale as if finally it can rest. You lift a slice to your mouth. It tastes like everything at once. Wood smoke, dried plum, salt, lemon peel. A hint of something like regret, and then like forgiveness. Quirky detail. Some requiem cheeses were so symbolic that people refused to eat them. Instead, they were buried like seeds or vows. One 14th century village in Bohemia placed their crisis cheese in a hollowed-out stone, sealed it with lead, and inscribed it, "For the children we do not yet know." In another account, a family in Wales brought out the same cheese at every funeral but never touched it. When asked why, they said, "It is not for the dead. It is for the living when they forget." You look around the courtyard. It's full now. Not crowded, just complete. People from stories you've half remembered. The baker from the ruined town. The monk with ink-stained teeth. The boy with the bone-handled knife. The woman with the fry cart wiping her hands, nodding once. No one speaks, but they don't need to, because the cheese is doing it for them. Telling you, you made it. You're still here. And that matters. Gentle closing jokes. Who knew cheese had an afterlife and a retirement plan? Some people bury time capsules. Medieval people just let it ferment. Requiem cheese because trauma tastes better with time. The candles flicker. Someone plays a slow note on a wooden flute. The scent of rosemary and ash fills the air. And you understand something. You weren't just following a story. You were walking through a recipe. One where grief, joy, and survival were ingredients stirred slowly, aged carefully, shared reverently. Not preserved in pages, but on tongues. In kitchens, in the gentle hush between bites. Final academic reflection. Is food the final memory keeper? When archives are burned, when names are lost, when languages shift, what remains? A flavor, a shared dish, a slice of something passed down not as fact but as feeling. Maybe cheese, like history, doesn't have to be exact. It only has to be true enough to nourish. You stand. Place the rind back on the plate. Someone blows out a candle. Then another. Then another. The night deepens. But not into darkness. Into peace. So here we are, friend. 30 pieces of a single story. Cheeses of grief, of hope, of bitter humor and quiet resolve. Fritters and mystery pies, butter wheels and ghostly wedges carved with forgotten moons. Some you tasted, soothes, some you only imagined. All of them were real, and not because they were perfectly documented, but because they mattered. Then someone waited, someone cooked, someone remembered, and now you've walked with them. You've stirred their pots, carried their bundles, stood beneath their archways, and in doing so you've honored their flavor, not with grand monuments, but with stillness, with breath, with the courage to keep listening when history speaks softly. So tonight, as your body sinks deeper into comfort and your mind begins to float, may you carry these stories not in your memory, but in your marrow. Because history isn't just in books. It's in banquets, in rituals, in the cheese you weren't supposed to eat but did anyway. That's the story for tonight. May your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.